I remember the moment I turned off the paved road and onto that rutted lane winding through miles of coastal marshland. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. Part of me was deliriously happy. Finally, I was escaping the clamor of the city. Another part was terrified. What was I doing? Hauling my entire life to a half-rotted cabin on stilts, surrounded by mosquitoes, tidal creeks, and deep mud. But I was Wanda Pierce, a burnt-out accountant with no family left and enough savings to attempt an off-grid dream. This was my fresh start, in the hushed marshes of South Carolina where I could breathe untainted air and listen to reeds whisper in the breeze. The lane snaked past ancient cypress trees cloaked in Spanish moss, their gray beards trailing in the humidity. My tiny sedan rattled over potholes, and the smell of brine and decay seeped in through the open window. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, just earthy, primal. My heart beat faster as the lane ended at a small clearing by a tidal creek. There, perched on wooden stilts, stood my new home, a weathered cabin with peeling paint, its porch jutting over the marsh. Sunlight glittered on the muddy water below. Exhaustion warred with excitement. I got out, legs stiff, and took in the surroundings. Cattails, sawgrass, the gentle hiss of insects. The horizon was a tapestry of marsh grass and distant pines. My only neighbor was a black and white egret perched on a half-submerged log, watching me with mild interest. I closed my eyes, letting the moist heat cling to my skin, telling myself this isolation was what I needed after a lifetime of fluorescent office lights and suburban sprawl. No more accounting ledgers. Just me, the marsh, and a bare-bones off-grid life. Inside, the cabin was small and musty, but workable. A single main room with a corner for the bed, a tiny kitchen nook, and windows that overlooked the tide flats. The previous occupant had rigged a solar panel on the roof, providing minimal electricity for lights, plus a generator as backup. A water barrel outside collected rainwater for basic washing. There was a composting toilet in a small adjoining hut out back. I carried my boxes up the steps, noticing the boards sagged ominously, then flopped onto the dusty couch. Through the open window, the marsh hummed with insect song. A breeze ruffled the curtains, carrying the wet, organic smell of mud and brine. I felt a pang of joy. This was real. Raw, but real. That first night, I cooked canned soup on a propane stove, then settled on the porch with a lantern, staring at the dark silhouette of reeds swaying under a slice of moon. The tide was out, revealing muddy channels glistening in faint starlight. Frogs and crickets created a lullaby that lulled me to doze. At some point, I jerked awake, maybe midnight or so. My lantern had burned low, the porch half in shadow, and I heard something, a quiet scraping from beneath the cabin. My heart hammered. Could it be a raccoon or an alligator investigating the stilts? I listened, breath held. Another scrape, then a soft splash, like something slipping into the water. The hair on my arms stood up. I leaned over the railing, shining the lantern. Nothing but black water swirling near the pilings. I tried to dismiss it as an animal foraging, but a tiny worm of unease took root. Morning chased away my fear. I discovered a half-eaten fish on the muddy bank, likely dropped by a heron or raccoon. That explained the noise, I told myself. I waded into the tasks of the day, checking the solar batteries, organizing my meager supplies, hauling in more water from the barrel for washing. By midday, the humidity was punishing. I retreated indoors for a short nap. When the late afternoon arrived, I decided to paddle a small canoe I'd bought second-hand around the creek, see if I could find a better spot to gather water or maybe dig for clams. The creek was broad enough for a gentle current, the tide creeping in, turning the water brackish. I drifted among towering reeds, the sun glinting off water. It was tranquil. Egrets took flight as I glided by. This was the peace I craved. But eventually, I noticed something odd. The reeds parted in a far corner, revealing a shape, a black silhouette of a person. I froze, squinting. The shape vanished. I paddled over, only to find dense reeds. No footprints, no path. Maybe my eyes played tricks. That night, I read by the soft glow of my single overhead lamp, battery draining. Sleep came easily until around midnight, when I woke to a familiar scraping beneath the cabin, more insistent this time. My skin prickled. I listened, heart pounding, then a faint tapping on the boards, almost like knuckles rapping from underwater. My mouth went dry. Summoning courage, I crept outside with a flashlight, shining it around the stilts. The tide was partially in, water swirling knee-high under the cabin. The beam caught only swirling silt, then a splash, a swirl of ripples. My pulse raced, but I saw no person or animal. After a few minutes of tense waiting, I retreated inside, double-latching the door. The next morning, stepping out onto the porch, I found a neat little arrangement of fish carcasses in a half-moon shape at the foot of the stairs. My stomach lurched. No way was that natural. Goosebumps erupted on my arms. Who would do this? I recalled Kyle Marion, a local crabber I'd met briefly in town. He'd told me, in passing, that the marsh had old ghost stories. Drowned colonists or escaped enslaved folks rumored to roam the flats at night, moaning for release. I'd chuckled politely then. But now, seeing these fish carcasses arranged with uncanny deliberation, I wasn't laughing. The day pressed on with stifling heat, the sun glaring. I forced myself to remain calm, telling myself it could be a local prank or an odd predator's stash. I busied myself collecting driftwood for a small walkway around the house. As evening fell, the tide crept back in, turning the stilt area into a murky pool. I decided I needed to talk to someone about the strange happenings. Kyle was the only local I knew well enough. I drove to the marina where Kyle sometimes docked his boat. I found him in stained overalls, unloading crab traps. When I told him about the fish circles and tapping at night, his expression darkened. "I've heard talk," he said quietly, "about folks seeing shapes in the water, or hearing knocking from below the surface. Some blame restless spirits, colonists who drowned in the marsh centuries ago, or slaves forced to hide in these wetlands who never made it out. The marsh can swallow a person. Some say it swallows their souls, too." A chill ran down my spine. "So you think ghosts are leaving fish on my porch? That's insane." Kyle grimaced. "Could be a spirit that's half in the water, half out, or maybe just an old tale. But be cautious. The tide's unstoppable, and the marsh hides old tragedies." I thanked him, uneasy but grateful for the warning. That night, I tried placing salt around my porch's perimeter. An old superstition I recalled reading somewhere. Couldn't hurt. Yet, around midnight, I heard the tapping again, rhythmic, as if someone gently knocked. My heart pounded like a drum. I stepped outside with my lantern. The salt line was undisturbed, but the tapping grew louder. Leaning over the railing, I peered at the water. My lantern's glow revealed a pale shape submerged up to its chest, an outline of a human figure, hair clinging to a gaunt face. My blood froze. The figure stared up with hollow eyes. Then, with a hiss, it vanished under the water, leaving me gasping. The tide lapped at the stilts, swirling away any sign of footsteps. I stumbled back inside, mind reeling with terror. Come daylight, the fish circle reappeared, more numerous than before. I nearly vomited. The fish were fresh kills, arranged as if a message. My nerves frayed. The shape in the water. I couldn't unsee those dead, hollow eyes. Over the next few days I tried to rationalize it, but each night brought new horrors. Once, I woke to a watery voice moaning my name. Another time, a slick trail of algae led from the water's edge to my porch. as though something crawled out. The sense of malevolence grew, along with heartbreak, as though this presence was stuck in sorrow. At my wit's end, I sought out Darlene Jones, an old friend who drove down from the city to see me. She arrived midweek, took one look at my haggard face, and insisted we figure this out. I told her about drowned spirits, about the possibility that centuries-old tragedies might haunt the marsh. She listened, alarmed but determined. "We need to do some research," she said. We visited the local historical society, scouring records of colonial settlements, missing persons, rumored slave escapes. Sure enough, we found references to a small settlement from the 1700s, wiped out by disease and flooding. Another entry mentioned enslaved individuals fleeing a plantation, hiding in the marsh, never to be found. The recurring theme was drowning or disappearance in the boggy flats, bodies presumably lost to the mud and tide. My chest tightened. If their ghosts lingered, maybe they wanted acknowledgement. One old document mentioned a marsh caretaker's ritual, a local practice of placing a lantern and reciting a prayer at the water's edge to honor drowned souls. Darlene and I decided to try something similar. That evening, as dusk gathered and the tide receded, we carried a lantern to the creek bank near the cabin. We placed the lantern on a makeshift platform of driftwood, setting fish bones from the circle — I'd kept them in a bucket — in a respectful arrangement. I felt ridiculous, but also desperate. Then we recited a simple statement. "We honor those lost in the marsh. We acknowledge your sorrow. We ask for peace." My voice trembled with sincerity. The marsh hissed with the wind. Our lantern flame flickered, reflecting on the muddy water. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, ripples spread from deeper in the creek. A shape broke the surface. My breath caught. That gaunt figure again? I glimpsed a pale face half submerged, but this time it didn't hiss or vanish. It lingered. My heart thundered. The face wore an expression of pain or longing. I raised the lantern. The face retreated slowly, dissolving into the murk. The hush that followed felt charged with emotion, as though the spirit's anger had eased. That night, no tapping disturbed our sleep. Darlene and I woke at dawn to find the fish circle gone, replaced by a single fish lying near the waterline, as if gently returned. My chest eased with relief. We concluded maybe the spirit accepted our gesture. Darlene stayed another day, noticing how peaceful the marsh felt now, less oppressive. When she left, I walked her to her car, hugging her fiercely, murmuring thanks for helping me face the haunting. Since then, the marsh has been calmer. I've remained in the cabin, carrying on my off-grid life. The nights no longer ring with watery moans. Instead, the tide's gentle slosh lulls me to sleep. I still lay a lantern near the creek occasionally, scattering a few seeds or flowers as an offering, acknowledging those lost souls. The fish circle never reappeared, and the shape in the water has vanished. The sorrow that once clung to the wetlands faded, leaving behind a gentle hush, as if the marsh released its old ghosts. Now, weeks later, I've grown comfortable with the tides, the mud, the heat. Mornings find me checking my small vegetable patch on a raised platform, safe from flooding. Evenings, I watch the sunset paint the water in gold and purple. The cabin no longer feels like a place of dread, but a home where nature and history entwine, reminding me that every land has stories, some tragic, some haunting, but all worthy of respect. Once in a while, Kyle the crabber stops by, dropping off a net of crabs or a small catch of shrimp. He remarks how I look calmer, that the cabin's vibe seems lighter. I just smile, nodding. I think back to the ghostly figure I saw, the circles of fish, the scraping from beneath the stilts, all of it, now a memory. Perhaps the drowned spirits found the peace they craved. If they remain, they no longer lash out. Instead, the marsh holds me gently, a caretaker among reeds, living humbly by the water's edge. When storms roll in from the coast, thunderheads looming, I sometimes recall that first terror-laced night. But now I listen to the downpour on the tin roof, feeling only awe for the marsh's fierce beauty. If the watery voice ever murmurs again, I'd greet it with kindness rather than panic, because I've learned a secret. The land's ghosts often just want acknowledgement. Once you give them that, you can coexist in quiet harmony. This is how life goes for me now. I rise early, do my chores, watch egrets wade in the shallows, catch glimpses of alligators drifting in distant channels. The hush at dusk is no longer eerie. It's comforting. The memories of city life and a desk job fade further each day. The old sorrow that weighed me down has lifted, replaced by the gentle acceptance of marsh mud and tidal cycles. I'm Wanda Pierce, ex-accountant turned off-grid marsh resident, and I've found, in these ghostly wetlands, a kind of redemption for both me and, perhaps, those lost souls who once drifted among the reeds. Some nights, I leave my porch lantern burning low, a subtle beacon against the moonlit water. I half expect a figure to glide up, but the water remains still, reflecting starlight. The breeze rustles the reeds, singing a lullaby rather than a lament, and I can't help but feel a sweet gratitude for the strange chain of events that brought me to the marsh, taught me humility in the face of old tragedies, and gave me a second chance to live simply, mindful of the hush in these silent South Carolina marshes. I still remember the jolt in my chest when I first saw the shimmering lights of Las Vegas receding in my rearview mirror. Heading west on a desert highway, I was leaving behind neon towers, smoke-laced showrooms, and the stale perfume of a life that never felt fully mine. I'd been Marisol Ramirez, a nightclub singer with a modest following, enough to pay the bills, keep me in cheap apartments, and lure me into thinking I had a future in that neon labyrinth. But the truth was, I'd grown tired of singing other people's songs under flickering signage. My voice felt caged. So I quit the city gigs, saved up just enough to buy a battered old RV, and set out for an off-grid patch of land in the Nevada desert. I craved quiet. I wanted to hear my own voice unfiltered, away from the glitz that had dulled my spirit. The land I'd found was a scraggly half-acre in the desert outskirts beyond the Vegas suburbs, near no real town, just miles of sagebrush, rocky outcrops, and punishing sun. The listing was cheap for a reason: zero infrastructure, a single wind turbine that likely hadn't spun in years, and a promise of a dramatic view of the desert's night sky. Perfect, I'd thought, for someone seeking solitude. I'd live in my RV, rig some solar panels and the old wind turbine for power, haul water from a distant gas station. My personal vow was to write new songs, honest songs that captured my own heart, not the pleasers the city demanded. I arrived at dusk, the desert wind blowing dust devils across the cracked ground. The meager dirt track ended in a clearing where an old sign read, "Private, keep out," in chipped paint, though it looked neglected. The ground was a hard-packed mixture of sand and pebbles, dotted with stunted cacti. My RV rattled to a stop. I stepped out, stretching. The hush pressed in. Far to the east, the faint glow of Vegas flickered, a smear of neon at the horizon. But out here, all was stillness. The sky erupted in pink and orange streaks, the sun sinking behind distant mountains. A tremor of excitement coursed through me. No more stage hustle, no more second-hand smoke, no more cheap motel rooms after gigs. Just me, the desert, and, hopefully, my real voice. That night, I unrolled a sleeping bag in the RV's cramped bunk, leaving the windows cracked for ventilation. A warm breeze carried the pungent aroma of dust and sage. The silence was intense. I drifted off, lulled by an occasional coyote yip. Then around midnight, something woke me. A flicker of light dancing through my window. Groggy, I peeked out. I half expected headlights from a passing car, but the lights were more erratic, neon-like glimmers swirling above the desert floor, maybe 100 yards away. My heart skipped. I blinked, and the lights winked out. Silence again. I told myself it was a reflection from a distant billboard, though the city was miles away. Shaking off unease, I slipped back to sleep. Morning brought scorching sun. I spent hours setting up the dusty wind turbine and some battered solar panels I'd brought from a salvage yard. My sweat soaked the collar of my t-shirt. The heat was brutal, over 100 degrees, but the dryness made it somewhat bearable if I stayed hydrated. Twice I took breaks, guzzling tepid water from a large jug. The land was unrelenting. No shade except the small awning I rigged on the RV. By afternoon, a faint breeze kicked in, spinning the turbine's blades. I felt a spark of hope that maybe I could power a mini-fridge or at least my old boombox for some background tunes. As the sun lowered, turning the desert gold, I strummed a few chords on my old guitar, trying to find my own style of melody. The city's lounge sets had taught me technique, but my soul needed raw honesty. The desert's emptiness gave me space to experiment. I jotted lyrics about wind and dust, about lost dreams and scorching sunsets. My fingers stumbled, unaccustomed to freestyle, but I felt alive, more than I had in months. That night, around 10, I tried to sleep again, this time lulled by the faint hum of the wind turbine. A distant coyote chorus erupted, which was reassuring. Nature's lullaby. Then, near midnight, I woke to a bizarre sound. It was subtle at first, like a faint jingle, reminiscent of slot machines. My heart skipped. Was I dreaming about Vegas? I rubbed my eyes. The jingle persisted, soft and tantalizing, drifting through the thin RV walls. I bolted upright, adrenaline surging. That was definitely not a coyote. Grabbing my flashlight, I slid open the RV door. Stepping outside, the night sky spread above me in a blaze of stars. The desert air felt cooler, though still warm by normal standards. The jingle repeated, as if from nowhere and everywhere, an echo carried by the breeze. I aimed my flashlight around, scanning the scrub. Then I spotted it. Flickers of neon-like light swirling in the dark, forming shapes reminiscent of dancing letters or shimmering illusions. My jaw went slack. It was as though a miniature Vegas sign glowed in midair, shifting and pulsing. A hush fell, broken only by the jingle, like coin payouts or old slot reels spinning, fear tangled with fascination. I took a shaky step forward, but the lights flickered, scattering into pinpoints that vanished. The jingle cut off abruptly, leaving my ears ringing with the memory. My pulse hammered. I'd heard rumors of desert illusions, heat mirages, or weird lights caused by temperature inversions. But neon? And that slot machine jingle was too specific. It triggered an eerie memory of nights spent performing in casino lounges, the perpetual chime of jackpots. I forced myself back to bed, mind spinning. Over the next days, I worked on the RV, tried to compose new songs, and kept glancing across the desert, half expecting to see phantom neon signs. The illusions, or whatever they were, didn't appear by day, but at night I often glimpsed faint glows in the distance, sometimes accompanied by that jingle. My solar array and wind turbine offered me intermittent electricity, enough to run a small fan or charge my phone. Yet I'd get random static bursts on the phone or the boombox, almost like interference from a powerful signal. The desert seemed alive with a presence that teased me. It felt like the city's neon had followed me here, mutated into a ghostly presence. I confided in Dean Volk, a desert handyman I'd hired to help me bury a small water cistern. He was a wiry man with a sun-leathered face, pragmatic to the core. When I mentioned neon glows and weird jingles, he shrugged. Desert can play tricks. Or maybe it's left over from some abandoned roadside attraction. Could be squatters messing around. I pressed him about local ghost tales, but he dismissed them with a wave. People see UFO lights sometimes, or ghost lights. I've never bought it. Just illusions, I say. I was half relieved he wasn't feeding me scary stories, but part of me suspected he was ignoring something deeper. A couple of weeks later, my friend Kelsey Crane arrived in her battered sedan, complaining about the dust. She was the one who used to party with me after shows in Vegas. Seeing my Spartan setup, she raised an eyebrow. "Marisol, this is extreme. You sure you want to wither under the sun, miles from nightlife?" I forced a laugh, explaining how the city's glitz drained me, how I needed an authentic life. She shrugged, but I saw worry in her eyes. That evening, we made a small campfire behind the RV, sipping cheap wine while the desert wind moaned. Kelsey teased me about lacking a real bed, but I felt grateful for her presence. Someone from the old days, bridging who I was and who I sought to become. Then, around midnight, we heard it, a faint jingle drifting across the desert floor. Kelsey froze, eyes wide. "Is that a slot machine?" she whispered, voice quivering. I nodded, heart pounding. We snuffed the fire, stepping away from the flickering embers. Sure enough, neon-like glows shimmered in the darkness, forming ghostly letters in pink and green. For a moment, it looked like a partial sign reading Jack or Luck. My skin prickled. The jingle swelled, merging with a faint crackle like distant electric static. Kelsey grabbed my arm. "Marisol, what the hell?" Her face shone with fear, the reflection of those lights dancing in her eyes. The lights pulsed closer, swirling around a tumble of rocks maybe 50 yards off, flickering as if in a frantic dance. The jingle built to a carnival-like crescendo that set my nerves on fire. Then a hush slammed down, and the neon letters blinked out. The desert returned to starlit stillness. Kelsey let out a breath, tears in her eyes. That was real, right? Not some hallucination? I nodded, throat tight. I've seen it before, and it's getting bolder. The next day, Kelsey insisted we do some detective work. She rummaged online with her phone when we found a faint signal for local legends. We discovered references to a half-built roadside casino from decades ago, rumored to have collapsed financially before completion. Some said a shady developer died out here, wandering the desert in search of lost fortunes. Another rumor suggested an entire pop-up casino once pitched near the highway, only to vanish in a catastrophic windstorm, leaving behind illusions of broken dreams. The stories were half-baked, but consistent in one theme: neon illusions haunting the desert, drawing unlucky souls into the dunes. My stomach twisted. At her urging, we scouted an old, cracked highway stretch near my property. We found battered remains of a rusted sign base, cacti sprouting around it, a few broken neon tubes. The site reeked of desert ghosts, literal or metaphorical. Kelsey ran a hand over the twisted metal, lips pressed tight. It's like some leftover from a failed casino. All that neon energy. Maybe it's imprinted on the land? She gave a nervous laugh, as though she'd said something silly. That evening, Kelsey prepared to leave, unsettled by our findings. Before she drove off, she squeezed my hands. "You have to be careful. This presence might be feeding off your connection to the city's neon. You left Vegas to find yourself. Maybe it's trying to drag you back into that world." I forced a confident smile, hugging her goodbye. But her words lingered, gnawing at me. The illusions escalated. Some nights, I heard not just jingles, but the muffled roar of an invisible crowd, like gamblers cheering or saxophones riffing on a lounge stage. Once, I woke to find the sky above the RV dancing with faint neon shapes, forming half letters like win or spin. My heart hammered so fiercely I could hardly breathe. Another time, while hauling water from a spigot miles away, the phone in my RV crackled, broadcasting a scratchy voice that repeated my stage name from Vegas. Miss Marie, Miss Marie, like a broken record. I almost fainted from shock. The illusions felt targeted, as though the desert spirit or entity locked onto my personal experiences, twisting them into haunted echoes. I turned to Dean again, hoping for a more open mind. He listened, arms folded, gaze a bit haunted. This time, he admitted hearing rumors of ghost lights, reminiscent of old Vegas signage. He'd brushed them off, but maybe they were real. Some locals call it the neon poltergeist, tied to a failed desert casino scheme. They say the investor had big dreams, poured everything into building a neon palace out here. A freak sandstorm or meltdown destroyed it all. Workers died, or so they claim. Now the leftover energy roams at night, luring folks to chase illusions of jackpots in the dunes. My mouth went dry. So it's a ghostly casino. That's insane. Dean shrugged. Desserts hold strange echoes. If there was tragedy or strong emotion, maybe it left a psychic imprint. All those broken dreams of neon fortune. You might be an easy target since you worked in showbiz. The entity could sense your link to Vegas neon. I recalled how I once yearned for bright lights, how I'd performed in small clubs hoping for a big break. That dream had soured. But maybe my leftover longing or frustration acted like a beacon. Fear spiked. Was the desert spirit or poltergeist feeding on my unresolved emotions? We decided on a final confrontation. We'd return to the rusted sign base, the rumored site of the failed casino, and attempt to lay the illusions to rest. Dean brought tools to dismantle any leftover wiring or equipment that might spark electromagnetic weirdness. I prepared a small personal ritual, my old lounge outfit from Vegas, plus a new song I'd composed, something honest about letting go. If the illusions drew from showbiz regret, maybe facing it head-on would break the cycle. We set out near dusk, driving across the cracked dirt, wind kicking up dust devils. The sign base jutted from the ground like a broken skeleton. Around it lay shards of neon tubes, twisted metal frames, half buried in sand. The sky flamed orange, the desert hush intensifying. Dean circled the site, fiddling with a detector for stray currents, while I stood near the sign base, heart pounding with dread. As darkness fell, a swirl of electricity prickled the air, raising hairs on my arms. Then the jingle started, faint but insistent. The sign base sparked with phantom neon, flickers of pink and green racing across the battered steel. My breath caught. Dean cursed softly, stepping back. A swirling wind howled, blowing sand in our faces. And from that electric swirl, ghostly shapes emerged. A partial facade of a slot machine, a neon arch reading "Lucky Spin," shining as if newly lit. My stomach flipped. The illusions were so vivid, I almost believed a real casino stood there, throbbing with promise and sin. The jingle swelled, merging with a hollow lounge tune that mocked my nights on stage. I felt my knees wobble, tears pricking my eyes. Memories of cheap applause, the humiliations I'd endured, all flooded back. The illusions pulsated, forming phantasms of gamblers, ghostly arms pulling slot levers. The air crackled with tension, as though the desert demanded I succumb. Summoning courage, I stepped forward. "I'm not your prisoner," I whispered, voice trembling. "I left that life for a reason. I'm done chasing neon dreams." The swirling lights flickered. The lounge tune warped into a distorted screech. I unzipped my bag, pulling out the lounge outfit, a glittery dress I once wore under casino spotlights, and flung it onto the broken sign base. "Take it," I shouted, tears in my voice. I don't need it anymore. I choose my own music now. A shockwave of wind slammed into me, nearly knocking me down. Dean stumbled, shielding his face. The illusions wavered, neon letters flickering. The jingle sputtered. I pressed on. I release these regrets, these illusions. Let them fade. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear my own words. Then, in a shaky voice, I hummed the new song I'd been composing, a simple, raw melody about finding truth in the hush of the desert. My voice quavered off-key, but I poured my soul into it. The neon illusions flashed in a chaotic strobe. The lounge tune dissolved into static, the slot machine shapes crumbling into shards of light. I kept singing, tears streaming down dusty cheeks, and the broken sign base glowed with one final spark, then died. The swirling neon ghosts collapsed into a swirling cloud of dust that vanished into the starry night. The wind slowed to a mere breeze, as if exhaling. Silence fell, broken only by my ragged breathing. Dean lowered his arms, eyes wide with astonishment. "I think you did it," he said hoarsely. I collapsed to my knees, head spinning. The sign base lay in darkness, no trace of neon. The desert around us seemed calm, almost gentle under the moonlight. We spent a while just recovering, letting the adrenaline fade. Finally, we loaded up the scraps of my old outfit, tossed them in a pit, burned them. The dress's sequins melted in the flame, a symbolic letting go of the city's lure. I watched the flames die, feeling an intense weight lift. If the Phantom Casino thrived on my own unresolved longing, I'd severed that tie. Back at my RV, the nights that followed were blissfully quiet. No slot machine jingles, no neon wraiths drifting across the dunes. The desert wind remained, but it carried only natural murmurs, not mocking illusions. My phone and boombox no longer crackled with interference. Sometimes I'd wake at midnight, half expecting to see pink and green flickers, but all I saw was starlight. The relief nearly made me weep. Eventually, Kelsey visited again, relieved by the sense of peace. She teased me about staging an exorcism with a lounge dress. We shared a laugh, both acknowledging how bizarre it all sounded. But it worked. I finally had the quiet I craved, no longer haunted by the city's neon ghosts. In the weeks to come, I poured myself into writing new songs, forging a raw style that blended desert silence with my soul's voice. My solar and wind setups gave me enough power to record rough demos. Sometimes I'd strum guitar at dawn, facing the pink horizon. The emptiness of the desert no longer felt menacing, but freeing. If occasional nightmares about neon-laced illusions plagued me, they eased upon waking, replaced by the rising sun's warmth. Dean swung by once more, curious. He found me painting the side of my RV with swirling desert motifs, my new creative outlet. He joked, "You seem less spooked now. No more ghostly jackpots?" I grinned, shaking my head. He nodded, a satisfied glint in his eye, as though half proud he'd witnessed something inexplicable yet overcome. I remain here, forging a life in the desert outskirts, close enough to see Vegas's faint glow at night, but far enough that its chaos can't reach me. I've learned that even dreams can turn toxic if they latch onto your fears. The phantom neon taught me that, forcing me to confront the illusions I once chased. Now, I sing for myself, unburdened by the stage. The desert wind, once a moaning threat, has become a friend, swirling around my small domain with a gentle sigh. On nights of a new moon, the desert sky is a black velvet dotted with diamonds. I sometimes stand outside, letting the hush enfold me. In my mind's eye, I see those neon lights flickering one last time, offering me a false jackpot, but I no longer yearn for it. My new jackpot is the hush of starlight, the ring of my acoustic chords under an infinite sky. I found my voice away from the neon, forging songs that ring with honesty rather than shallow glam, and the ghostly illusions, gone, set free by an act of renunciation and a humble desert flame. Even so, I keep a small reminder. A single broken piece of neon tubing I found at the sign base that final night. It sits on my makeshift windowsill, a trophy of sorts. Whenever I doubt my path, I glance at it, remembering the swirling illusions that nearly consumed me. Then I smile, step outside, and let the desert remind me that real light doesn't come from cheap neon. It comes from the sun, from the quiet acceptance of who I am, and from a desert that offers infinite emptiness for me to fill with my own authentic music. That's enough for me. Marisol Ramirez, ex-lounge singer, off-grid dreamer, safe from the haunting glow of illusions I left behind. I remember the sound of cicadas droning in the humid Arkansas heat when I first turned off the main road and onto a narrow dirt lane that led to Lake Ouachita. After years working as a nurse in the city, years that ended in heartbreak and burnout, I'd decided on a radical change. An off-grid cabin in the middle of Ouachita National Forest, near the lake's sprawling, deep waters. The pictures I'd seen online promised serenity, a rustic wooden cabin with a small dock, solar panels rigged haphazardly on the roof, and the forest's green wrapping it like a secret. It was exactly the hush I craved. But as I drove deeper along that lane, dust rising behind my battered sedan, my nerves prickled with a mix of relief and dread. The city had been my entire life. Hospitals, endless shifts, fluorescent corridors, the beep of monitors that still haunted my dreams after losing a patient dear to me. I couldn't face those halls anymore, so I'd sold most of my things, found this cabin listing at a steal of a price, and driven across half the country to start over, far from city lights. Maybe here I would find peace. Maybe I'd find a reason to keep living in the wake of sorrow. My first glimpse of the cabin sent a flutter through my chest. A modest structure of weathered wood, perched near the water on a slight rise. A single window overlooked the lake, tall pines standing sentinel around it. A small dock jutted into the still water. The forest hush settled in as I parked under a scraggly oak. Everything exuded an air of quiet expectancy, like a stage waiting for its lone performer. I stepped out, wincing at the sweltering heat. The air smelled faintly of pine resin and brackish water. Cicadas whirred, a constant backdrop that turned the silence into a living thing. I hiked up the short gravel path and climbed the porch steps, feeling them creak underfoot. The door was unlocked. Apparently, the previous occupant had left it that way for me. My heart thumped with excitement. This was my new start. Inside, the cabin felt dim and dusty, but livable. A single room with a bed in one corner, a small wood stove, a kitchenette with a propane burner, and a battered bookshelf. Solar-powered lamps hung from the beams. A narrow door led to a tiny bathroom rigged with a composting toilet. I set my boxes down, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. This was it, a chance to heal, to exist quietly beside Lake Ouachita, to let the forest and water mend what city life had broken. That first evening, I took a short walk down to the dock. The late sunlight glinted on the lake's surface, turning it to molten gold. The pines rustled in a soft breeze, offering me occasional whiffs of cooler air. In the distance, a fisherman's boat purred across the water, barely audible. My heart eased. I could do this. I could find solace here. I sat on the dock, trailing my fingers in the water. It felt lukewarm against my skin, and I almost considered a swim, but the sky was already pinking with dusk. Another day. Night fell, and the cabin's single overhead lamp cast cozy shadows on the rough walls. I made a simple dinner of canned soup on the propane burner. As I ate, the forest's nighttime symphony rose. Crickets, frogs, an owl's distant hoot. It lulled me. I fell asleep quickly on the small bed, content for the first time in months. Sometime after midnight, though, I jerked awake. My pulse hammered. Unsure why. The cabin was dark. Outside, the crickets had hushed. Then I heard a faint, rhythmic tap from near the dock. My skin prickled. Tap, tap, something hitting wood. I crept to the window, peering through the gloom. Moonlight revealed the dock stretching into the lake's dark expanse, but I saw no figure, no drifting log. The tapping stopped. I told myself it was likely a fish or turtle knocking. The hush returned. After a long, tense minute, I sighed and climbed back into bed, heart uneasy. The next morning I found a fish carcass on the dock, half-eaten, tail flapping in the breeze. Probably left by a raccoon, I assured myself. Still, the sense of creeping dread clung to me. I forced it aside. I had chores to do. Unpacking, checking the small solar battery, inventorying my groceries. The day's heat was brutal. I took breaks, sipping water, letting the cabin's weak fan blow over me. Later, I ventured into the nearby town of Mount Ida for supplies, about 40 minutes away. There, I met a store clerk named Megan Riley, a friendly woman in her late 30s. She noticed my out-of-state plates and asked if I'd moved to the area. When I explained about the cabin near Lake Wachita, her eyes widened. "Which cabin exactly?" she asked, curious. I described it, and she frowned. "Heard some folks called it the Cursed Cabin. People talk about weird noises at night, a sense of gloom. Past owners never stayed long, but maybe you'll be fine." She shrugged, trying to sound casual. My stomach tightened. So that explained the cheap price. That evening, I took a short canoe ride to explore the lake's coves. The water was calm, reflecting pines and the orange sky. I felt more at ease. The rumors of curses or midnight noises were probably just local lore. I'd faced enough real nightmares in the hospital. A few moans in the dark wouldn't drive me away. But the next few nights, the odd events piled up. Once, at around 2 a.m., I heard scraping under the porch, then footsteps sloshing in the shallows by the dock. Another time, I found muddy footprints leading from the shore up to my door, but then disappearing. No return tracks. The cabin's interior sometimes resonated with a faint sigh, as if wind moved through cracks, yet the windows were shut. My nerves frayed further when I discovered more fish carcasses neatly arranged near the water's edge. The arrangement was too deliberate to be random. Desperate for answers, I confided in Megan during my next grocery run. Her face grew troubled. "I've heard rumors of a drowned spirit, maybe a child or woman who died in these waters decades ago, never found. Some folks said they've seen shapes in the lake at night. You want my advice? Put out a small offering or do a prayer by the dock. Could be restless souls." She said it with a half-apologetic shrug, as though she knew how crazy it sounded. Still, I was open to anything. That evening, I lit a small candle near the dock, placed a handful of flowers, and whispered a shaky prayer, apologizing for intruding if the land was unsettled. The water gently lapped, a breeze stirring my hair. No ominous sign or spectral presence manifested. For a moment, I believed it might help. But near midnight, I woke to the distinct sound of splashing, frantic as if someone thrashed in the water. My chest seized. Leaping up, I grabbed a flashlight and tore out onto the porch, heart hammering. The beam cut across the dock, revealing violent ripples. Then I heard a low, mournful moan drifting from the lake's surface. My throat constricted. "Hello?" I called, voice shaking. The moan grew into a keening wail that sent terror through my veins. In the flashlight beam, I glimpsed a pale shape half submerged, a face with eyes reflecting the light. Then it vanished beneath the surface with a swirl. Silence. Adrenaline roared in my ears. I dashed to the water's edge, shining the light into swirling darkness. No sign of a body or footprints. My legs trembled. If that was a person, I had to help. But the lake returned only quiet ripples. After a minute, I stumbled back inside, locking the door. Sleep eluded me the rest of the night. At dawn, I found more fish carcasses, arranged in a circle near the dock. My stomach churned. The face I'd seen, it was gaunt, childlike, or maybe womanlike, but definitely human. Could a ghost or drowned entity be leaving me these offerings? Or was it some living person playing a sick game? Fear burned in my gut. Feeling I had no choice, I sought out Ezekiel Pike, a local fisherman rumored to know Lake Ouachita's hidden lore. Megan directed me to his boathouse near a secluded cove. I arrived in mid-afternoon, found him mending nets. He was tall, sinewy, with weather-worn skin and sharp eyes. When I mentioned the cursed cabin, he grimaced. "Heard about that place," he said in a gravelly voice. "They say a child drowned there in the 1960s. Folks claimed they never found the body. Others speak of a woman searching for her lost baby, wandering the shoreline. Could be rumor. But I've fished these waters long enough to know something's off near that cabin." I swallowed hard, explaining the fish circles, the whales, the glimpses of a face. Ezekiel's gaze turned somber. If a spirit lingers, it might be reaching out, wanting recognition. Some say you gotta lay them to rest with a ritual or find their remains. Lake's big, though. Lots of nooks, old stumps, underwater pockets. Hard to find a drowned person from decades ago. The concept of searching for a decades-old corpse in a vast lake felt impossible. But I had to try something. Ezekiel offered a suggestion. Sometimes acknowledging the soul's story is enough. Lighting a candle, reading a prayer, or making a small shrine by the water. But if the spirit's attached to that cabin specifically, you might need to discover what actually happened. Without that truth, the haunting might not end. We decided to rummage through local newspaper archives, or maybe talk to older residents who might recall the tragedy. Over the next 2 days, with Megan's help, I scoured microfilm in a dusty library. We found mention of a missing child named Lily Davis, who allegedly drowned in Lake Ouachita in 1962, right near the area my cabin stood now. The mother, Mary Davis, was said to have roamed the shore for weeks, searching, then vanished herself. No official record of her body turning up either. My throat tightened, reading these sad details. A child's life ended. A mother's heartbreak. Could their spirits be bound to the cabin's shore? Armed with these names, I decided on a final nighttime memorial. If Lily and Mary haunted the cabin, maybe acknowledging them by name and telling them they weren't forgotten would break the curse. With Ezekiel and Megan by my side, I prepared for the vigil. We gathered flowers, small candles, and a simple cross I'd carved from driftwood. We'd place them at the dock, recite a few words of farewell, and hope the spirit found rest. That night, the 3 of us stood on the dock, the moon high over Lake Ouachita. The water lay still, reflecting starlight. My heart pounded as we arranged the flowers, lit 2 candles that flickered in the breeze. The cross we set at the dock's end. I cleared my throat, voice shaky. "To Lily Davis and Mary Davis, we remember your story. We mourn your loss. Please, find peace in these waters. We mean no harm, and we free you from the sorrow that binds you." My eyes stung with tears, recalling all the times I'd lost patients in the hospital. This was different. But grief was grief, and I knew it intimately. For a moment, all was quiet. Then the water at the dock's edge rippled. My breath caught. A pale shape surfaced, a face with hollow eyes, hair streaming across the water. Megan stifled a gasp. Ezekiel gripped my arm. The figure stared. Lips parted in a silent moan. I forced myself not to recoil. Instead, I managed a trembling whisper. "We see you, Lily, or Mary. We're sorry." A tear slipped down my cheek. The figure hovered, the water swirling around it. Suddenly, a wave of sorrow flooded me, as if I could feel the mother's heartbreak at losing her child, or the child's terror at drowning. My knees buckled. Megan steadied me. The figure let out a keening wail, so raw it tore at my soul. The candles guttered in the wind. I clung to the cross, tears flowing freely. "We remember you, Lily and Mary. Rest now," I choked out. The wail rose to a crescendo that vibrated the dock underfoot, then died abruptly. The figure's face dissolved into ripples, the water smoothing in its wake. The hush that followed felt immense. Ezekiel exhaled, shoulders trembling. Megan whispered, "They're gone," voice laced with shock. I nodded, tears still on my face. We stayed on the dock a while, letting the night air wash over us. The tension in my chest eased, as though a weight had been lifted. The next morning, the fish carcasses were gone, replaced by a single white lily floating near the dock. My heart caught at the symbolism. No new footprints marred the shore, no wails broke the night. In the days that followed, the cabin felt lighter, more welcoming. I slept soundly, lulled by frogs and crickets rather than ominous splashes. The sense of gloom that once clung to the water had dispersed, replaced by the gentle lap of tide and a calm breeze. I remained at the cabin, forging my off-grid life in earnest. I fished occasionally, read books by the dim solar light, and penned reflections in a journal about the haunting. Megan would visit with groceries, no longer worried I'd flee in terror. Ezekiel sometimes dropped by with fresh-caught trout, offering a friendly grin. The hush of Lake Ouachita became a comfort instead of a threat. One afternoon, as I canoed across the cove, I paused to think of Lily and Mary Davis. Their story ended in tragedy, but perhaps by naming them, acknowledging their sorrow, we freed them from an endless loop of despair. My tears welled up again, and a sense of kinship formed. I, too, knew loss. If they could rest, maybe I could find my own peace, moving beyond the guilt and heartbreak from my hospital days. Weeks turned into months. I cultivated a small herb garden near the porch, rigged a better water filter, even hammered together a simple walkway to the dock so I wouldn't sink in mud. Each morning I rose with the sun, watching mist swirl over the lake. Each night I sang softly to myself, the lullaby of the forest answering with crickets. The cabin truly felt like home. One twilight, I left a small bouquet of wildflowers tied to the driftwood cross at the dock, a final tribute to Lily and Mary. The water glistened in soft gold. A breeze carried the faintest sense of gratitude, or maybe it was my imagination. But I smiled, inhaling the sweet, marshy air. The nightmares that once plagued me, both from the hospital and from the cabin's haunting, had eased. The hush of Lake Ouachita taught me that sorrow can be acknowledged, not shoved aside. Occasionally, rumors reached me that the cursed cabin had become blessed cabin, with local fishermen saying no more ghost sightings. I'd chuckle to myself. It was never about curses, just about unsung grief needing a voice. I understood that intimately now. Freed from the city and from a restless spirit, I found a sense of purpose in the wild hush. Standing on the porch at sunset, the sky aflame over the lake, I can't help but reflect on my journey. I was a broken nurse, escaping heartbreak, but this off-grid life, and the ghosts I faced, taught me resilience. The sorrow that once weighed my soul now feels transmuted into gentle compassion for the lake's lost souls and for my own wounds. Lake Ouachita remains serene, lapping at the dock. The pines whisper in the wind, telling me they accept me as caretaker of this humble patch of Arkansas wilderness. And so here I stay, Samira Jackson, caretaker of a once-cursed cabin, no longer haunted by fish circles or moaning in the dark. The drowned mother and child rest, their story honored. And in honoring it, I, too, found release. The hush of night no longer terrifies me, but cradles me in understanding. That, I believe, is the real power of acknowledging ghosts, whether they be of drowned families or personal regrets, so that both the living and the dead may find peace in the silent, star-filled canopy of Lake Ouachita's timeless waters. I still remember the moment I decided I'd had enough of software engineering. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the constant ping of notifications, the suffocating feeling that each day blurred into the next. I wanted out. I craved real air, real ground beneath my feet, not the bland corporate carpet that smelled of stale coffee. That's why, after half a year of saving and planning, I found myself driving my old hatchback into southwestern Washington, heading for the Gifford Pinchot National Forest, the trunk loaded with basic supplies and a second-hand yurt. My heart pounded with a mix of excitement and dread. I was Hannah Green, ex-engineer turned wannabe off-grid homesteader, about to live in the damp, rain-soaked embrace of a Pacific Northwest forest. The lane off the county road was narrow, framed by towering evergreens dripping with moss. Even in late summer, the sky was a brooding gray, a drizzle turning the path into a muddy slog. My car's tires skidded, but I pressed on, glimpsing occasional signs that read USFS or Service Road. The hush of giant ferns and old-growth trees enveloped me. Eventually, I found a small clearing by a modest stream, my new home. The space was just large enough to pitch the yurt, store my meager solar kit, and chop wood for the small stove I'd rely on. No neighbors, no paved roads, no phone signal. Perfect, I told myself with forced optimism. Setting up the yurt proved more challenging in the persistent drizzle. I wrestled the canvas, hammered stakes, and tried to keep my supplies from sinking into the mud. All the while, the forest seemed to watch. The damp air soaked my clothes, plastering my hair to my face. By evening, I'd assembled the yurt's skeleton of lattice and poles, draped the thick canvas over it, and secured it as best I could. I stepped back, surveying the round structure that looked so out of place among the giant ferns. My heart fluttered with pride. I'd done it. I was living off-grid, or close enough. I had solar panels to catch whatever sun broke through the clouds, a tiny stove for heat, a composting toilet rig, and jugs of water for a start. The stream might serve as a water source if I filtered it carefully. That first night, I crawled into my sleeping bag on the yurt's wooden platform, listening to the patter of rain on canvas. The soft rustle of leaves outside was mesmerizing. Once or twice I heard twigs snap, but I told myself it was small wildlife or the wind. Despite the damp cold, I felt a flicker of exhilaration. I'd left behind deadlines, Slack messages, endless Zoom calls. I was free. Morning brought a low-hanging mist that clung to every bough. I fired up my little propane stove for coffee, stepping outside to see the world drenched in silver droplets. The forest smelled of wet earth and cedar. The stream gurgled nearby, half hidden by thick ferns. My plan was to install the solar panels in a small clearing, but the overcast sky made me wonder if I'd ever gather enough energy. Still, I pressed on. A few days passed quietly, with me settling into routines, chopping wood, hauling water, doing small repairs on the yurt's platform. The forest's hush was broken only by bird calls and the gentle patter of drizzle. My mind started to unwind from the anxious coil it had been in for years. But that hush carried an intensity I hadn't expected, as though the giant conifers themselves held secrets older than I could imagine. Then came the first sign that something wasn't quite right. One damp evening, just after dusk, I heard drumming in the woods, a steady, rhythmic thump-thump, thump-thump, echoing between the trunks. I froze, ladle in hand, stirring soup over my tiny stove. The noise was faint but unmistakable. Maybe local campers, but I was miles from the official trails. I stepped out with my flashlight, calling, "Hello?" The drumming stopped. I swept the beam across dripping ferns and shadowy boles, seeing only strands of moss hanging in the gloom. My chest tightened. Could be some neighbor far off. Maybe I was overreacting. The next night, the drumming returned, closer. Fear tightened my gut. I reminded myself I was just not used to forest sounds. But this was no random noise. It had a distinct beat, as though someone hammered a hollow log. Again, I investigated outside, shining my flashlight until the beam caught movement behind a massive cedar. I glimpsed a shape, dark, upright, slipping out of sight. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear. I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" Silence answered. Then the drumming picked up deeper in the forest, luring me to follow. But I resisted, returning to the yurt, latching the door. That night, I barely slept. The following morning, I found cryptic carvings on a few trees near my camp. Strange symbols, loops and lines etched into the bark, still fresh with sap oozing. My spine prickled. Could this be some local cult or just bored teenagers? But who would trek this far into the forest? I was unnerved enough to consider calling for help, but I had no signal. The nearest ranger station was a 2-hour drive on muddy roads, and I wasn't sure how to explain weird carvings and nighttime drumming. That day, I forced myself to keep busy, installing a small fence around my tiny vegetable patch. The drizzle let up, letting a shy sun break through. Around midday, I heard an engine approaching. Relief flooded me. Someone normal. It turned out to be Caleb Mercer, a local wilderness guide. He hopped out of a dusty pickup, nodding a greeting. "You must be Hannah Green. I heard someone set up a yurt out here," he said. I invited him for coffee, grateful for human contact. He told me he guided hikers and mushroom foragers in the Gifford Pin Show, sometimes passing near my area. After some small talk, I mustered the courage to mention the drumming and the carvings. Caleb's expression grew tense. Some folks talk about old forest spirits or weird sightings around here. A few hikers have gone missing. Some mention Wendigo-like creatures or forest guardians. Might be superstition, but these woods can feel off. A chill fluttered in my belly. I asked if I should be worried. He shrugged, admitting he wasn't sure, but offered to check the area for me. We spent an hour combing the vicinity, spotting more carvings on trees. They formed patterns we couldn't decipher. Loops, swirling lines reminiscent of stylized animals, or maybe they were random scrawls. My anxiety grew. Caleb suggested I talk to Eliza Stone, the owner of a small general store deeper in the forest who collected local lore. She might know if these carvings match an old legend, he said. The next day, I hiked to Eliza's store, a cozy wooden shop that sold everything from canned beans to handcrafted charms. She was around 60, with a stout frame and knowing eyes. When I described the carvings, her face darkened. Some folks around here mention a spirit in the Gifford Pin Show, older than any tribe's memory, an entity that claims parts of the forest. They say missing hikers or odd carvings often pop up in these claimed zones. Could be pure legend, or maybe something more. She rummaged through a drawer, producing a few charcoal rubbings of similar symbols. My chest constricted. They matched the loops I'd seen. So these might be boundary marks, Eliza said, voice low, like a sign the forest spirit or creature warns trespassers. I'd tread lightly if I were you. That evening, I forced myself to stay calm, cooking dinner, double-checking my door latch. But the dread was tangible. The drumming started again at twilight, pounding from multiple directions. My breath caught as I realized it wasn't just one drum. There were multiple beats, echoing in a pattern. Something out there was orchestrating this. My mind conjured images of hooded figures or inhuman watchers. Gritting my teeth, I clutched a flashlight and stepped onto the yurt's small deck. The sound seemed to swirl among the tall firs, calling me. My heart hammered with indecision. I took a shaky step forward, shining the beam. Mist clung to the ferns, wisping around the tree trunks. Then, a flicker of movement near a cluster of salal bushes. My pulse skyrocketed. I caught a hint of a shape. Tall, slender, arms longer than normal, or was that just a shadow? The shape glided behind a trunk. A wave of raw fear washed over me. That's no normal person, my gut screamed. Retreating inside, I barricaded the door with a chair. The drumming persisted for a half hour, then tapered into silence. I stayed awake, listening to every rustle outside. At dawn, I found new carvings on more trees, creeping closer to the yurt. The message was clear. Something wanted me gone, or was testing me. Panicking, I sought out Caleb, who arrived mid-morning, concern etched on his features. When I told him about the shape, he paled. I rarely see anything unnatural, but I've heard stories of a Wendigo-like creature or forest guardian. If it's marking territory, you might be in danger. Eliza, who happened to show up with him, nodded gravely. Some say this spirit lures people away from their camps. Then they vanish. Could be it feeds on fear, or maybe it defends the forest from perceived threats. She gave me a searching look. Have you cut down any big trees or disturbed anything significant? I shook my head, tears pricking my eyes. I've tried to live lightly, just clearing small brush for a garden. I don't want to provoke anything. They exchanged glances. Caleb suggested we might attempt a warding ritual. Some local lore recommended leaving offerings for forest spirits, or reciting a protective chant. It felt half silly, half essential. I was desperate. So we gathered that evening around a small fire pit near the yurt, the sky gray with drizzle. Eliza brought a handful of herbs and a necklace charm she claimed wards off malevolent woodland entities. I stood, heart pounding as we lit the herbs, letting fragrant smoke swirl around. Eliza murmured a short invocation, something about harmony with the ancient forest. We set the charm on a tree stump, scattering salt in a circle. My face flushed with embarrassment, but fear overrode pride. The gloom of dusk pressed in. The drumming started again, soft and mocking. My pulse soared. Then we heard rustling. Caleb hoisted his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the ferns. A shape emerged. A tall figure with elongated limbs, hunched posture, its eyes glinting in the reflection of the flashlight. My blood froze. It looked half human, half something else, draped in moss or bark, mouth open in a silent snarl. The drumming swelled from the darkness, as if multiple unseen shapes beat on logs. My heart hammered so loudly I feared I'd faint. Eliza pressed me forward. I approached the shape, trembling. "We respect this forest," I choked out. "We don't want conflict." The shape hissed, the sound guttural. The drumming hit a fever pitch. My legs wobbled, but I held steady, tears burning my eyes. "We won't destroy your territory," I managed. "We just want to live peacefully." The creature snarled, stepping closer. A wave of stench, decay and wet earth flooded my nostrils. I gagged. The creature's eyes glowed with an uncanny light, reflecting the fire's flicker. Then, as if in challenge, it raised a spindly arm, pointing at me. My mind screamed, "Run!" But Eliza behind me whispered, "Stand your ground. Show no fear." I forced my knees not to buckle. I'll leave offerings," I said weakly. "I promise. Please let me stay." The shape's mouth twisted, releasing a deep, ragged breath. The drumming flared, then the shape slunk backward into the trees, vanishing. The sounds receded. The forest hush returned, leaving the three of us shaking. In the ensuing days, I followed through on my vow. Each dawn, I placed a small offering of seeds, fruit, or a pinch of salt near the carvings. I avoided cutting any living trees, only gathering fallen branches for firewood. The drumming lessened, though occasionally I'd hear faint beats at the edge of the forest. The shape never again showed itself so directly, but the fear lingered, a constant knot in my stomach. My entire goal was to find peace here, yet I couldn't fully relax. Each rustle at twilight made me jump. My solar-charged lights cast eerie shadows across the yurt's interior. Sometimes I found new carvings on distant trees, but never closer than the boundary we'd established. It felt like a stalemate. Caleb visited often, checking on me. He'd lead me on short hikes, pointing out safe areas to gather firewood. Once, we discovered a ring of mushrooms in a clearing, each cap carved with small lines. My heart jolted, but Caleb urged calm. It's leaving signs. We just have to respect them. Eliza provided more charms, small woven talismans she believed would keep malicious energy at bay. I hung them around the yurt's entrance, feeling half ridiculous yet comforted. Over time, the tension gradually eased. The drumming became rare, a distant echo rather than a nightly terror. The forest's gloom lightened in my mind, replaced by a cautious acceptance. Months passed. I managed to establish a decent routine: gather mushrooms, filter stream water, maintain the yurt's stove, and do part-time remote coding gigs whenever I drove to the nearest town for internet. Yes, ironically, after leaving software engineering, I found myself doing small contract tasks just to earn enough for basic supplies. But it felt different now. No corporate office, no soul-crushing deadlines. The forest, despite its spooky introduction, offered me a simpler life. One drizzly afternoon, while foraging for edible plants, I stumbled upon a hidden glen. Mist clung to fallen logs, moss blanketed the ground. I noticed a half-rotten trunk etched with the same swirling pattern from the carvings, but older, nearly grown over with lichen. My pulse quickened. The center of the trunk was hollow, forming a natural shrine. Inside, I saw small bones. Animal, I guessed, arranged in concentric circles. The stench of decay lingered. My heart lurched with anxiety. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me, the hairs on my neck rising. Slowly, I turned. The shape stood a few yards away, taller and more defined than before. Its face, if you could call it that, was partly obscured by shadows, its limbs adorned with bark or thick moss. My breath caught in my throat. A wave of dread hammered me. Was it upset I trespassed on a sacred spot? Trying not to panic, I raised my hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm sorry," I whispered, voice shaking. I didn't mean to intrude. The creature exhaled a rattling sound, stepping closer. My instincts screamed to run, but my legs refused. Slowly, I backed away from the trunk, lowering my gaze. The creature watched, silent, the forest drizzling around us. Then, in a motion as fluid as wind-blown branches, it turned and melted into the brush. The tension in my chest released, and I collapsed to my knees. Gasping, I realized that despite my attempts at living gently, I'd crossed into a deeper part of its domain. Maybe I'd discovered a place meant only for the spirit or whatever it was. After that confrontation, I doubled my efforts to show respect, leaving small offerings of berries or seeds near the boundary. The shape no longer approached the yurt. Sometimes I glimpsed it at a distance, perched on a fallen log, or slip-sliding behind a cedar trunk. Each time I felt fear, but also a growing reverence. The forest had guardians beyond my understanding. If I minded my place, I could coexist. By the time winter's edge crept in, the rains turned colder. The yurt's stove became my savior. I'd watch the mist swirl outside, thick as soup, yet, ironically, I felt safer. The shape had receded to the deeper woods. The drumming seldom sounded, only faintly on certain nights. Whenever I heard it, I'd whisper a quick apology if I'd done anything to disturb the land. That seemed enough. In the end, I found what I came for. Space to breathe, a chance to rediscover who I was without corporate demands. The Gifford Pinchot Forest, though haunted by an ancient presence, allowed me to stay. We brokered a silent treaty, my respect for its boundaries, its tolerance of my small yurt. I even found a kind of gratitude for the shape, for it forced me to approach the forest humbly, to let go of illusions of conquering nature. Instead, I dwell in a delicate alliance, mindful that one misstep might reignite the spirit's wrath. Now, as I stand outside my yurt, a gentle drizzle pattering on the canvas roof, I look at the towering firs with a sense of awe. The carvings remain on some trunks, but no new ones appear near the yurt. My garden patch thrives in partial rain. My meager solar kit manages enough power for a reading lamp. On rare evenings, I hear faint drumming far away, a soft reminder of the watchers who roam among the pines, and I whisper a quiet good night, letting them know I hear them, that I haven't forgotten their claim. That's life in the Gifford Pinchot for me. Hannah Green, ex-software engineer who traded code for mud, a yurt, and the friendship of a forest spirit I'll never fully comprehend. But I've learned enough to know that not every haunting is about evil. Sometimes it's about territory, about forging respect between humans and the older, wilder forces that preceded us. And in that compromise, I've found peace, or the closest thing to it, amid the damp shadows of Washington's endless green. I still recall the exact moment I left my old life behind and turned onto the winding road that led me deeper into Cuyahoga Valley. The hush of the forest crept into my car as I passed the final sign of civilization, a boarded-up gas station that marked the boundary between the suburban outskirts and the wilderness. I was Mel Daniels, an ex-nurse seeking escape after a tragic event at the hospital had shattered my nerves and my heart. The cabin I'd rented was miles away from the nearest paved road, perched at the edge of the national park with only a stand of old hardwoods and a narrow ravine separating it from the heart of Cuyahoga's dense forest. I'd arrived in late afternoon, the sky a wash of pale gray as sunlight broke through thinning clouds. My first glimpse of the place, an unassuming log cabin, roof patched with mismatched shingles, a small porch that seemed to sag under its own weight, nevertheless felt like a promise. The forest rose around it like a protective barrier, the thick canopy letting only a few beams of sun streak through. A gravel clearing gave me enough space to park, and beyond that, the ravine, a steep drop where the valley floor lay hidden under a cloak of fog. I shivered, though it wasn't cold, just the sense that I was on the brink of a vast unknown. Setting foot on the porch, I heard a soft rustle in the trees. A breeze, perhaps. I forced a smile, ignoring the twist of anxiety in my stomach. I reminded myself, you came here to heal, to find quiet. The city's frantic tempo, the hospital corridors, the memory of a patient I couldn't save. Those belonged to another life. Here, in the hush of the forest, I hoped I could piece myself together again. I spent my first few days in a flurry of practicalities, hooking up a small solar panel rig to power a couple of lamps, organizing my canned goods, testing the old potbelly stove that would serve as my main heat source. The nights brought a thickening fog that crept up from the ravine, swirling around the cabin's foundation. I'd gaze out the window, watching the vapor pool among the trees, turning them into silhouettes in a white sea. At first, it was beautiful, mesmerizing, but a faint unease always prickled my skin. The fog felt almost alive, pressing in on the cabin's walls. One quiet morning, I decided to explore the ravine's edge. I followed a narrow path that skirted the drop-off, the damp ground muffling my footsteps. Twisted roots protruded from the soil, and the air smelled of wet leaves and rich earth. The fog lingered in the hollows, so dense I couldn't see the valley floor. About half a mile from the cabin, I found a vantage point where the ravine opened slightly, revealing a hidden creek far below, churning with meltwater. The hush was profound, broken only by a distant crow's cry. That hush both soothed and unnerved me. It reminded me of how alone I was if anything went wrong. That same evening, I sat on the porch, a kerosene lantern flickering at my side. Dusk settled, turning the sky a bruise-colored shade. Fog gathered as it did every night, sliding between the trunks, pooling around the ravine. My eyelids drooped. The forest's lullaby, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, drifted me toward sleep. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic drumming. For a moment, I thought it was my own heartbeat, but it continued. A soft thump, 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 carried on the mist-laden air. My drowsiness vanished. I straightened, scanning the swirling fog. Thump, thump, then silence. I waited, breath trapped in my throat. No further sound. Eventually, I retreated indoors, telling myself the wind can make strange echoes. Yet a seed of dread took hold, refusing to let me sleep easily. The next day, I ventured to a small visitor center located just outside the park's boundary, partly for supplies and partly to satisfy my curiosity about the area. That's where I met Trina Polk, a park ranger in her early 30s, who stood behind a desk sorting pamphlets. She greeted me with a friendly nod. When I mentioned I'd moved into a cabin near the ravine, her eyes lit up with interest. "You're living out there alone?" she asked, handing me a brochure on Cuyahoga Valley trails. "It's gorgeous, but the fog can be intense. We've had some unusual disappearances over the years. Hikers losing their way. You be careful." I admitted I was a bit spooked by the thick fog. Her brow furrowed with concern. "If you hear or see anything strange, call us. Some folks claim the valley's haunted by echoes of the past, usually just folklore, but better safe than sorry." I forced a laugh, though unease tightened my gut. I'll keep that in mind. Armed with more groceries and the ranger's cautionary words, I returned to my cabin. The day's chores occupied me, stacking firewood, mending a leak in the roof, and reading a battered medical textbook I'd brought, half out of guilt for abandoning nursing. But as dusk neared, the memory of that soft drumming weighed on me. Was it just imagination, or something real? The second sign that something truly wasn't right came that night around midnight. I jerked awake, heart pounding, unsure why. The cabin's interior lay dark, the single lamp extinguished to conserve battery. I listened, my ears straining. Then I heard a low moan drifting from the ravine side of the cabin. A moan so soft, so mournful, it sounded like a wounded animal. My chest tightened. Could it be a deer or raccoon in pain? Thump, thump. That gentle drumming again. Fear coiled in my stomach. Steeling myself, I grabbed my flashlight and unlatched the door. Fog swirled around my ankles. Each step outside felt like stepping into another world, the beam of light revealing a swirling white sea of moisture. The moan came again, echoing from near the ravine. My mind screamed that I was being reckless, but a half-buried nurse's instinct to help overcame me. I inched forward, shining the flashlight. The beam caught fleeting shapes in the mist, gnarled roots, thick ferns swaying. The moan rose, tangling with the hush. "Hello?" I called, voice trembling. "Are you hurt?" Silence answered. Then the drumming resumed, a slow, insistent beat. My skin crawled. That was no injured animal. Something else was out here. My heart hammered as I backtracked to the cabin, slamming the door behind me, chest heaving. The moan and drumming faded as if mocking me. The next day, the tension escalated. I woke at dawn to find footprints in the mud near the porch. Bare human footprints, spaced oddly far apart, leading from the ravine's direction to the cabin, then back again. My blood ran cold. If it was a person, why come silently in the fog, only to vanish? And if it wasn't a person? I raced into town, seeking out Ranger Trina, who listened with a tight-lipped frown. She accompanied me back to the cabin, scanning the footprints. She murmured that they didn't look quite normal, the stride too long. She found no other clues. I might post a notice or do a quick patrol, she offered, though her eyes showed doubt. We parted ways, me feeling no safer. It was Reverend Harper who finally gave me a name for what I faced. I'd met him by chance at a local diner, an older man with silver hair and a gentle smile. He'd overheard me talking to Trina about weird occurrences, and politely asked if I believed in restless spirits. I was desperate enough to say yes, or at least consider it. Over a mug of coffee, he told me local tales about a small church that once stood in a ravine hollow, wiped out by a catastrophic flood. The congregation's final service ended in tragedy, some losing their lives to the rushing waters. Some say their voices echo in the valley fog, searching for a final rest. He said softly, "If your cabin stands near that ravine, perhaps you're hearing their pleas." I felt a chill. Could the moaning and drumming be ghostly reenactments of an old service or funeral rite? The footprints in the mud, did they belong to drowned congregants? My logical mind balked, but fear won out. I asked how to help them move on. The Reverend suggested acknowledging their presence, maybe placing a memorial near the ravine, reciting a prayer for lost souls. If they're truly bound by tragedy, a simple act of compassion might free them. Thus, the final confrontation took shape. I told myself it might be pointless superstition, but after nights of dread and illusions in the fog, I had nothing to lose. I prepared a small wooden cross carved from a fallen branch. On it, I wrote in memory of the lost congregation, not knowing their names. Then, as twilight deepened, I carried the cross to the ravine's edge, accompanied by Trina and, to my surprise, Reverend Harper, who insisted on helping. The fog already congealed among the pines, a white tide creeping up the slope. We lit 2 lanterns, the glow barely penetrating the swirling mist. My stomach churned with fear as we approached the vantage where I'd glimpsed flickers of movement. The forest was eerily still. We hammered the cross into the soft ground, placed a circle of small stones around it. Harper murmured a brief prayer about guiding lost souls to peace. Trina's hand shook, holding her lantern. We waited, breath hitching. Sure enough, the moan emerged from the ravine below, soft at first, rising in pitch. My blood pounded. Then the drumming started, an insistent beat that quickened. The fog around us thickened, swirling, forming ghostly shapes. My throat went dry. Shadows flickered, and I thought I saw faint outlines of robed figures. Or was it just twisted tree trunks? Harper raised his voice, calm but firm. To any souls lost in these waters, we acknowledge your pain. We mourn your tragedy. We ask you to find rest. This place holds a memorial in your honor. The moan crescendoed, turning into overlapping voices. My eyes stung with tears. It sounded like a chorus of sorrow carried on the rolling fog. The drumming hammered in my chest, echoing the thunder of my heart. Trina clutched my arm, her own eyes wide. The shapes in the mist drifted closer, intangible. My fear soared, but I forced myself to speak. "I'm sorry you were forgotten," I choked out, tears slipping down my cheeks. I live here, but I mean no harm. Please, rest." A sudden gust of cold air blasted us, swirling the fog into a vortex. The moans and drums reached a frantic peak. I felt sure I'd pass out from terror. But then, in a blink, The wind died. The phantom chorus halted, replaced by a profound stillness. The swirling shapes dissipated. The drumming ceased. My ears rang with the absence of sound. The cross stood upright under our lantern glow, unwavering. We stood there, trembling, tears on our faces. Harper offered a quiet "Amen," then exhaled. Trina swallowed hard, giving me a shaky smile. I just stared at the cross, relief washing over me in a wave so strong my legs nearly buckled. From that night forward, the cabin truly became a place of peace. No more moaning drifted from the ravine. No more drumming circled me in the fog. The footprints never reappeared, and the forest hush lost its menacing edge, becoming simply calm, the way a forest hush should be. Mornings found me making coffee as sunlight filtered through the pines, the ravine swathed in benign mist that parted easily under day's warmth. Trina checked in occasionally, remarking how I seemed more relaxed, the tension gone from my eyes. I admitted I slept soundly now, unafraid of midnight noises. Reverend Harper visited once more, smiling at how the cross remained upright, unmolested by storms or wildlife. He explained that sometimes just naming a tragedy, honoring it, can lay restless spirits to rest. I nodded, thoughts turning to my own tragedy in the hospital. Could it be that acknowledging sorrow was the key for me too? By late autumn, I felt truly settled. The orchard patch I'd started behind the cabin grew a few scraggly vegetables. My solar kit provided enough power for a small fridge. The ravine glowed with falling leaves, turning the fog a soft gold at dawn. Sometimes I'd stroll to the vantage point, gaze down at the creek's shimmering ribbon, and place fresh wildflowers near the cross. Each time, an emotion, part sorrow, part gratitude, touched me. The lost congregation was not forgotten. Their story was recognized, their presence honored. In return, they let me be, or so I believed. I found a measure of healing in that exchange. The nightmares about the hospital corridors eased. When I woke at night, it was usually to the gentle hush of the forest, not terror. The place that once felt haunted became my sanctuary, a testament to how confrontation, compassion, and a little humility can tame even the darkest corners, whether of a forest or one's own soul. Yes, the fog remains a constant companion, rolling in each dusk, softening the edges of trees. But I no longer fear shapes in its depths. If any phantom lingers, it lingers in peace, content to watch me chop wood or plant seeds. My chest loosens whenever I recall that first night's moan, the dread that consumed me. We overcame it with a simple wooden cross and an apology for forgotten souls. Maybe that's the real lesson. The living can offer rest to the dead just by bearing witness, by refusing to let them fade unnamed. Now, in the hush of a winter evening, I stand on my porch, the potbelly stove's warmth at my back. Fog thickens among the pines, swirling around the ravine. Instead of terror, I feel curiosity, even comfort. The ghostly drumming is gone, replaced by the gentle drip of condensation from branches. The hush is no longer oppressive, but serene. I watch the cross near the vantage point, a faint silhouette in the dim. In my mind, I whisper a quiet greeting to the lost congregation, acknowledging them as neighbors. And the hush answers with tender silence, a silent acceptance that, at last, this land is ours to share, unafraid. I smile into the mist, breathing deep. I realize that Cuyahoga Valley, for all its eerie fog and rumored disappearances, gave me back something precious, the knowledge that sorrow can be named, and in naming it, one finds the seeds of healing. This forest, with its rolling ravines and swirling fog, taught me to face the ghosts of my own regrets, just as I faced those haunting the ravine. In letting them rest, I, too, found rest. And so I remain, living quietly off-grid, a part of the forest's hush, no longer a city nurse fleeing heartbreak, but a caretaker of a small cabin on the edge of a vast green. The moan of restless spirits replaced by the gentle sigh of pines. The frantic drumming replaced by the calm beat of my own newly settled heart. I still remember the electric thrill that coursed through me the first time I saw Lake Erie, spreading out before me like a sheet of hammered steel under a stormy sky. I'd driven for hours across Ohio farmland, hoping for that moment. The sight of open water, the promise of an unbroken horizon. In that instant, all my regrets and the failures I'd left behind in the city seemed smaller. I, Robin Fontes, a traveling watercolor artist, was determined to live off-grid in a yurt perched on a bluff over Lake Erie, near Geneva on the lake, and capture the lake's moods in my artwork. The property was cheap, painfully so. A battered advertisement had promised unbeatable views of Lake Erie, accompanied by the disclaimer, "Off-grid yurt, bluff location, extreme weather possible." Sounded perfect. I'd grown tired of couch surfing and motel living while chasing commissions. Painting city skylines or random farmland scenes left me feeling hollow, but the idea of living by a great lake, with its storms and restless waters, felt like a dream. So I'd sold off most of my belongings, bought a used truck, and made my way here. The lane leading to the bluff was rutted and narrow, half overgrown by weeds. My truck bounced and groaned, but eventually the path opened onto a small clearing among stunted, wind-bent trees. There, perched on a wooden platform, stood my new home, a yurt about 15 feet in diameter, canvas sides bleached by the sun and wind. A scraggly wind turbine rose nearby, squeaking forlornly in the breeze. A row of battered solar panels sat propped at an angle, waiting for sunlight that seldom broke through the endless clouds. The bluff dropped off maybe 50 yards from the yurt, plunging to rocky shoreline below. The sound of waves crashing drifted up, low and constant, as though the lake was humming a tune only it could understand. Stepping out of the truck, the wind slapped my cheeks, bringing the briny tang of lake air. I shivered, though it wasn't that cold, just a raw bite in the breeze. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, turning the water a sullen gunmetal hue. My heart hammered with excitement. I'd come here to paint exactly this, the drama of a vast, ever-shifting lake under restless skies. No more city claustrophobia, no more bouncing between stale apartments. I hauled my art supplies, a cooler of groceries, and a couple of suitcases into the yurt, ignoring the way the canvas walls snapped ominously in the wind. Inside, it was as basic as expected. A low cot, a tiny wood stove, some shelves, a small chest for storing food. A battery system hooked to the solar panels, and the turbine hopefully gave me enough electricity for a light or two, maybe to charge my phone on good days. Water would come from jugs, or a small rain catchment barrel out back. The floor was rough plywood, but it was enough. I set my stuff down, exhaling shakily. This was my new life, off-grid, near the watery frontier of Lake Erie. The first few days passed in a blur of chores. I rigged up my small generator as a backup for stormy times. I hammered extra stakes around the yurt platform, worried about the ferocious wind that threatened to peel the canvas right off. The lake never stopped roaring beneath the bluff. Even on calmer days, a dull thunder of surf reached my ears. At night, I'd doze off to that lullaby of waves, half lovely, half intimidating. It wasn't long before I met Marvin Wolf, a local fisherman. One afternoon, I spotted him trudging up the bluff with a battered tackle box in hand, curiosity shining in his weathered eyes. We exchanged polite greetings. He asked if I was the new tenant in that canvas tent thing. I laughed, nodding. He said he fished these waters for decades, lived a bit inland, Heard rumors about someone going off-grid on the bluff. Over a quick lunch of canned beans at my makeshift table, Marvin offered cautionary tales. Winter storms that hammered the cliff, sudden wind gusts that tore off rooftops, and a note about weird lights some folks reported over Lake Erie. Some say they're UFOs. Others say ghost lights, he grunted. Me, I think the lake just has its illusions. Don't pay 'em any mind. I shrugged off the ghost lights as local lore, more intrigued by his stories of monstrous lake storms. But that night, after sundown, I got my first taste of eerie phenomena. The wind howled, rattling the yurt's frame. Huddled in my sleeping bag, I tried to ignore the thunder of waves below. Then I heard a faint, distant cry rising from the direction of the cliff. My eyes flew open. The cry repeated, wavering, almost like someone calling, though the words were unintelligible. Cold fear coiled in my gut. I told myself it might be the wind funneling through rocky crevices, or a gull's cry distorted by darkness. But the next morning, I found fish carcasses near my porch, half-eaten, arranged in a loose spiral. My stomach lurched. Did coyotes or raccoons do that? But the pattern looked deliberate. Shaken, I tossed them over the bluff, trying not to dwell on it. A small voice whispered that maybe Marvin's talk of illusions was incomplete, that something more sinister might lurk. As days turned into a week, the odd events piled up. Twice I woke to discover fresh fish guts in odd shapes on the porch. Another time, I heard low moaning echo along the shoreline at midnight, mingling with the crashing surf. By day, I tried to paint the lake's shifting blues and grays, but found myself anxious, glancing over my shoulder. The wind turbine squeaked ceaselessly, a tortured cry in the gusts. My solar panels barely charged in the gloom. Desperate for a second opinion, I ventured into Geneva-on-the-Lake, a small resort town further down the coast. Most places were off-season quiet. I found Alicia Sawyer, a coastal conservationist who manned a tiny environmental booth near the marina. She perked up when I mentioned living on the bluff. That area sees a lot of erosion, she warned. Waves can undercut the cliff, but it's also known for odd sightings. People blame a lake banshee or some water spirit that calls to folks at night. Chills prickled my arms. I asked Alicia if she believed in that stuff. She shrugged. I'm a scientist, so I lean on natural explanations. But enough locals claim to hear wailing or see flickering orbs over the water. Let me know if you need help or want me to check the shoreline with you. I do beach cleanups weekly. That invitation felt like a lifeline. The loneliness weighed on me, heightened by the weird occurrences. Alicia came by a few days later in an old sedan, carefully navigating the rutted path. We spent the afternoon walking the bluff's edge, collecting scattered plastic and driftwood. She found clusters of fish carcasses that had washed ashore below, scattered in bizarre patterns. My stomach knotted. She frowned, admitting it wasn't typical tide arrangement. Could be gulls, but it's strange. That night, Alicia and I built a small fire near the yurt, bracing a tarp to shield us from the wind. Over s'mores and half-joking banter, I recounted the eerie cries, the fish remains, the swirling illusions of lights I sometimes thought I saw far out on the lake. Alicia listened, face pale. If there's a spirit or banshee, maybe it's linked to drowned souls or old tragedies, she suggested. Lake Erie's claimed plenty of lives. Storms sinking boats or fishermen lost in squalls. My heart sank at the idea. Could those restless spirits roam the waves, wailing at night for lost companions? Maybe the fish carcasses were some twisted offering. Alicia volunteered to stay until midnight to see if anything happened. Sure enough, around 11:30, the wind picked up. Clouds veiled the moon, throwing the bluff into a deeper dark. The lake's roar below sounded angry, waves slamming the rocks. We sat near the fire, scanning the gloom. Then a faint cry rose, drifting across the water. Alicia and I locked eyes, tension spiking. The cry grew louder, twisting into a mournful wail that froze my blood. I peered toward the bluff's edge, half expecting to see someone clinging to the rocks. Instead, I spotted flickers of pale light dancing above the surface, ghostly orbs weaving in and out of the foam. My lungs constricted. Alicia gasped, grabbing her camera. She captured only darkness and swirl. The wail intensified, slicing through the wind. My ears rang with the sheer sorrow in that voice, too raw to be a gull or the wind. Then, as if in response, fish carcasses rained onto the bluff, flung from the dark. Alicia and I screamed, staggering backward. The remains thudded onto the grass, sliding in the mud, forming a half circle around the fire. The stench of rotting fish filled the air. My chest heaved with horror. The orbs out on the water shimmered, then blinked out. The wail died, leaving the hush broken only by our ragged breathing. That night, Alicia had no desire to sleep in the yurt. Neither did I. We drove back to town, adrenaline raging. She offered me her couch, but I insisted I had to face my home. The next morning, though, we returned together, disposing of the fish remains with gloved hands, hearts still pounding. This was no normal phenomenon. Something out there targeted me, us, a presence connected to the lake's depths. We decided knowledge was power. Alicia and I scoured local records at the county library, rummaging through microfiche for drowning incidents, boat sinkings, or rumored folklore about a lake spirit. We found references to a lady of the lake, rumored from the 1800s. Some said a bride drowned on her wedding day, cursed to roam the shoreline. Others spoke of an ancient creature that devoured fish and lured lonely souls into the water. The stories contradicted each other but shared a common thread: a sorrowful cry, spectral lights, fish remains left as warnings. Marvin Wolfe chimed in with his recollections of hearing ghostly singing during storms, though he claimed he never saw orbs. Maybe it's gotten bolder with you around, he mused grimly. Feeding on your fear? The suggestion made me shudder. We resolved to confront it, do something symbolic, a memorial or a cleansing. If this entity was a drowned spirit hungry for acknowledgement, perhaps an offering or apology might quell it. If it was something else, we had little to lose by trying. We set the date. A night with a waning moon, mild forecast. Alicia, Marvin, and I gathered near the yurt. We built a small fire pit at the bluff's edge, lighting torches to keep hands free. The plan was to recite a short prayer or statement acknowledging any lost souls, place an offering, flowers, fish, or something symbolic, then see if we could break the cycle of nightly terror. My heart pounded with dread and anticipation as the sun slipped below the horizon, painting the lake in murky purple. By 10 o'clock, the breeze stiffened. Waves crashed below in a steady thunder. Alicia and Marvin stood with me by the fire, nerves on edge. We placed a small wreath of wildflowers near the cliff, plus a candle in a jar as a beacon of compassion. We honor anyone lost to these waters, Alicia said softly, voice trembling. We acknowledge your sorrow. Let there be peace. My eyes stung with tears. I silently added my own plea. I just want to live here, in harmony, not fear. Minutes passed. The wind hissed, carrying the smell of damp fish. Then the wail arose from the lake, faint but unmistakable, as though responding to our call. My stomach churned. The orbs flickered out on the dark water, weaving closer to the rocks. Marvin tightened his grip on a lantern. The wail built, heartbreak incarnate, and the orbs soared up the bluff. We braced ourselves, expecting fish carcasses or some violent manifestation. Instead, the swirling lights formed a ring above our heads, shimmering with pale luminescence. My breath caught. The sorrowful cry surrounded us, resonating like a dirge. I felt tears rolling down my cheeks, my heart battered by the raw grief in that voice. Alicia sobbed softly, trembling. Marvin's knuckles whitened on the lantern handle. The presence hovered, an anguished hush that demanded recognition. Summoning courage, I whispered. We hear you. We see you. We're sorry for your pain. The wail peaked, a piercing note that rattled my bones. Then, as if a string had snapped, it cut off. The orbs flickered, dancing erratically, then one by one blinked out. The hush that followed felt colossal, echoing in my ears. My chest heaved with shaky breaths. For a tense moment, we stood under the flickering torchlight, waiting for a final assault. None came. The wind died to a mild breeze, waves continuing their rhythmic crash below. The sense of oppression lifted, replaced by a calm hush. Slowly we exhaled, gazing at each other with relief and disbelief. Dawn light revealed no fish carcasses on the bluff, no new signs of malevolent presence. For the first time in weeks, my chest felt loose, unburdened. Alicia returned to her coastal conservation duties, hugging me tight before leaving, her eyes filled with relief. Marvin gave me a subdued nod, promising to check in occasionally. I stood alone at the bluff's edge, the water glinting with sunrise sparkles, the air crisp. A gentle wave of gratitude warmed me, tears slipping down my cheeks. It was over, or at least the nightly terror had ceased. Days turned into weeks without whales, orbs, or fish remains. The wind still howled sometimes, storms battering the yurt, but the presence of unnatural sorrow was gone. I poured my renewed energy into painting, capturing Lake Erie's changing moods in watercolors. Each morning, I set my easel near the bluff, letting the breeze ruffle my hair as I splashed color on the page. Dusky grays for stormy days, pastel blues for calm afternoons, luminous gold for sunset reflections. My style flourished, freer than anything I'd done before. It was as if casting out the haunting spirit also freed my creative spirit. Occasionally, I'd sense a faint echo at night, maybe the wind carrying a distant note of sadness, but it never escalated into the banshee wail or swirling lights. I'd open the yurt's flap, let the moonlight spill across my canvas, and feel only a gentle hush. The lake's waves soothed me to sleep, not once waking me in dread. Now, as I stand on the bluff months later, the air bright with a late spring warmth, I let my gaze wander across Lake Erie's wide horizon. The water glimmers under midday sun. No sign of ghostly orbs. The battered wind turbine squeaks behind me, generating just enough power to run my mini-fridge. My solar panels soak up the bright day. I've sold a handful of my new paintings online, ironically thanks to the spotty phone signal I can sometimes catch near a certain tree. Enough to keep me going. Enough to confirm that leaving the city was the right choice. I think back on those nights of terror, the swirling illusions, the despairing wail, the fish offerings reeking of rot. I still don't fully understand if it was a drowned spirit, a banshee, or some ancient lake entity. Perhaps Lake Erie's centuries of shipwrecks and lost souls left a residue of sorrow that coalesced into that presence. Or maybe a single tragedy fueled it. Regardless, showing compassion and acknowledging the pain seemed to break the cycle. Our simple vigil, our honest apology, freed me to live here without fear. Sometimes I step to the bluff's edge at twilight, listening to waves lapping the rocks below. The wind tousles my hair, carrying the faint tang of brine. I recall how I once cowered behind my yurt door, trembling at the unearthly cry. Now, I breathe in the lake's vastness, letting it fill me with quiet awe. Maybe the ghosts remain in the depths, but they're at rest, or at least content to leave me be. I remain, continuing my off-grid life, forging paintings from the ever-changing palette of sky and water. Marvin drops by with fresh fish now and then, joking that I should have plenty of fish after all that fiasco. Alicia visits to exchange updates. She's thrilled my daily routine no longer involves ghostly calls. We sometimes gather driftwood from the beach, discussing ways to protect the shoreline from erosion. I feel part of this landscape in a deeper way, connected to the lake's pulse, unafraid of its hidden sorrow. Each morning, I set up my easel, letting the wind challenge me to anchor my brushstrokes with confidence. Each evening, I watch the sun sink behind the watery horizon, painting it in fiery oranges and pinks. The hush that falls is one of grace, not dread. If I close my eyes, I can almost hear the echo of that old wail, but it's softened to a memory, a reminder that even the darkest presence can be met with empathy. I can't say all is perfect. The windstorms still rattle my nerves. Storms off the lake can flatten my meager garden, and the solitude can weigh heavily at times. But the difference is that I no longer cower from midnight illusions. I've faced the lake's darkest shadow, extended a hand of compassion, and found my rightful place on this bluff. That's enough for me, for now, for however long I choose to dwell on the edge of Lake Erie, capturing its beauty in watercolors that reflect both the tranquil surface and the roiling undercurrents of sorrow and triumph. And so this is my life, Robin Fontes, traveler, artist, caretaker of a yurt on a wind-battered bluff, a once-haunted place that now thrives with calm. The hush of Lake Erie still sings with possibility, no longer overshadowed by malevolent wails. I found a way to let the dead rest, and in doing so, I found my own rest, forging art from the quiet sunrise and painting hope over the horizon where ghost lights once danced. I remember the day I first caught sight of that battered wooden sign deep in Wayne National Forest. The paint was nearly gone, but I could just make out Shawnee Stagecoach Trail, half buried by weeds and creeping vines. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as a rush of excitement and anxiety fluttered in my stomach. I was Elias Carter, 31 years old, a self-confessed frontier lore fanatic who'd spent too many years reading dusty history books in cramped library corners. I wanted to touch the past, not just read about it. That's how I ended up bumping my sedan down a rutted dirt lane, heading for a half-forgotten log house near that storied trail, eager to live off-grid in the quiet heart of Ohio's Wayne National Forest. It was early fall, the leaves just starting to turn gold and russet in the thick canopy overhead. Dust rose in pale clouds behind my car. I braked periodically to clear debris or check for washouts. This was definitely not city terrain. The hush around me grew, broken only by birds flitting between branches or the occasional crack of a twig under my tires. I'd grown used to honking horns and the monotony of suburban roads, so the green darkness of these towering oaks and pines felt simultaneously thrilling and unnerving. I kept telling myself the realtor had assured me the house was rustic but livable, a phrase that could hide a host of problems. Still, I didn't care. I'd read about this old stagecoach route for years, the drama of bandits, travelers, lost caravans, and I craved that immersive brush with history, no matter how run down the property might be. After what felt like an eternity of twisting and turning, the lane opened onto a small clearing. My heart gave a leap. There stood the log house, its rough timbers dark with age, the roofline sagging in places, a porch leaning so severely I wondered if it might collapse the moment I stepped on it. But there was a quiet dignity to it, the way it nestled among tall ferns and overshadowing trees. The late afternoon light slanted through branches, illuminating patches of moss and creating a tapestry of light and shadow across the yard. I parked, killed the engine, and sat for a moment, letting the hush soak in. This was my new life. I felt both bold and foolish. When I got out, my boots sank into soft earth, the scent of damp leaves all around. No sound of distant cars or neighbors, just the forest's slow exhale. I approached the house, key in hand, my heart thumping with anticipation. The porch creaked in protest under my weight, but it held. Inside, the cabin was dim. A single large room with a rough stone fireplace in one corner, a rickety table in another. A narrow ladder led up to a small loft. Dust motes drifted in a beam of light from a grimy window. The place smelled of old wood and a faint mustiness that hinted at long disuse. I let out a breath, a grin tugging at my lips. It felt like stepping into the pages of frontier lore. Even if I'd never built a fire in a stone hearth before, or lived off a generator for electricity, I was determined to make it work. That first night, I unrolled my sleeping bag by the fireplace, ate a cold dinner of canned beans, and listened to the forest slip into darkness. Without city lights, the blackness outside was total, interrupted only by faint moonlight that occasionally pierced the leafy roof overhead. I dozed off to the sound of crickets, an owl calling from somewhere beyond the yard. Then, at some point around midnight, I jerked awake, heart pounding. The cabin was still, the embers in the hearth glowing faintly. My ears strained. For a moment, I heard nothing. Then a distinct echo drifted into hearing. Hoofbeats, distant yet unmistakable. A chill raced up my spine. Could it be someone riding a horse at this hour? The sound lasted only a few seconds before fading. Probably my imagination, I told myself, though my heart thumped like a drum. I forced my eyes shut, eventually finding a restless sleep. The next morning, I shook off the memory of phantom hoofbeats as just a dream. Instead, I explored the property, discovering a faint footpath behind the house that meandered into thick underbrush. Judging by the pattern of depressions in the ground, this was likely part of the old stagecoach route. My pulse quickened at the thought of wagons lumbering through here centuries ago, carrying mail, gold, or families searching for a new start. The day passed in a happy blur, me snapping photos, journaling notes about the ruts in the earth, all the while imagining the travelers who once came this way. By evening, I felt more confident. Maybe that midnight scare was just exhaustion from the move. But the second night, I heard them again. Hoofbeats faintly echoing around midnight, accompanied by a soft rattling that could have been a wagon's wheels. I jumped out of my sleeping bag, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped onto the porch. The yard lay in moonlight, dew shimmering on ferns. The sound persisted for a few moments, then vanished as though carried off by the breeze. No sign of horses or wagons, only the hush of a waiting forest. My nerves prickled. Perhaps there really was a riding group passing in the distance. Though who would ride these abandoned trails at such an hour? In the days that followed, my excitement warred with rising fear. By day, I documented old mile markers, battered signposts, lumps of stone that might have been an old station foundation. By night, I dreaded the phantom hoofbeats. They came irregularly, sometimes 2 nights in a row, sometimes skipping a night. Whenever I tried to investigate, the sounds would stop. Once, I found fresh wagon wheel ruts in the mud after a storm. My heart nearly lodged in my throat. A real wagon would leave more evidence, plus footprints or manure. But these ruts emerged from the forest and vanished after 20 yards, as if the trail simply ended. I took photos, my hands shaking. Something beyond logic was replaying a piece of the past. Worry gnawed at me. I tried telling myself it was just illusions, my overactive imagination from reading too many frontier ghost stories, but I couldn't ignore the crispness of those ruts. I confided in the nearest local official, Sheriff Fowler, who listened politely but gave me a gentle smile that hinted he thought I was chasing shadows. "If you see actual trespassers, let me know," he said. "But ghosts aren't my jurisdiction." Right. So I turned to an unlikely ally, Becca Marsh, a traveling blogger who specialized in haunted or historic roads. I'd stumbled upon her site while researching the Shawnee Trail's background. She'd posted a call for any leads on authentic stagecoach history. I emailed her, describing my nightly hoofbeats. She drove down eagerly, her battered Jeep spitting gravel as she arrived. We clicked over a shared love for old frontier stories. At first, she was half skeptical, but after seeing my photos of wagon ruts, she got serious. "We're capturing this," she said, brandishing a digital recorder and a thermal camera. That evening, we set up a small stakeout near the old trail behind my house. We placed an audio recorder, a motion trigger camera, and hid ourselves behind a clump of brush. The moon rose overhead, painting the log house in silver. Midnight approached. The forest hush thickened. I felt my pulse in my throat. Then the hoofbeats started, soft at first, building into a steady clip-clop. My heart hammered. I squeezed Becca's arm and she nodded, pressing record on the camera. The wagon rattle followed, a creaking that made my skin crawl. Then came the scream, a raw, anguished shriek that froze my blood. My eyes blurred with tears. It sounded so desperate, like someone was living their final moments of terror. Becca's face went chalk white as the recorder picked up everything. We saw fleeting shadows passing through the trees, half silhouettes that might have been horses or a driver. The darkness swallowed them, leaving behind the echo of that scream. Then, as though continuing its route, the phantom coach moved on, the hoofbeats fading to nothing. My entire body trembled. This was no dream. We'd captured real evidence of something replaying a tragedy. We retreated inside, huddling over the recorder. The audio was crystal clear. Hoofbeats, wagon wheels, a scream. It made my hair stand on end. We scoured old records again. A snippet of a local newspaper from 1839 mentioned a stagecoach that never arrived at its destination, rumored to have been robbed or lost on the trail. Another snippet from 1841 described travelers hearing ghostly sounds near the route. The pattern repeated across decades, always with talk of wagons disappearing, passengers never found. Becca and I suspected we were dealing with a residual haunting, a loop of the coach's final moments. But the intensity of the scream suggested it was more than just a mild echo. Perhaps the spirits were locked in that doom-laden instant, searching for release. If so, how could we help them rest? Our plan took shape over the next days. We crafted a memorial sign reading, "In memory of those lost on the Shawnee stage," hammered together from spare wood. If the missing travelers never got a proper burial or acknowledgement, maybe a symbolic gesture could break the haunting. We'd hold a midnight vigil, recite something to let them know their story wasn't forgotten. It felt half superstitious, half deeply necessary. On the chosen night, the sky was clear, stars thick overhead. Becca and I built a small fire near the trail's edge, the log house dark behind us. We placed the memorial sign upright, ringed by stones, then lit a few lanterns. My stomach churned with fear and anticipation, especially after hearing that scream nights before. The forest seemed to hold its breath as midnight approached. The hoofbeats began softly, sending adrenaline through my veins. My palm slicked on the sign's edge. We stood in the flickering lantern glow. The wagon rattle joined, accompanied by the faint crack of a whip. A chaotic rush of noise crescendoed. Thundering hooves, wheels clattering, voices shouting in panic. My pulse hammered. Then, as if crossing the threshold of reality, the shape of a phantom coach broke into the clearing, half seen in moonlight. Horses, driver, shadows of frantic passengers, all flickering as though torn from another time. The scream tore through the night, raw anguish. My eyes welled with tears. It was so visceral, so heartbreaking. Summoning courage, I stepped forward, voice shaking. "We remember you," I shouted. "Your journey didn't vanish unnoticed. We set this marker so no one forgets your fate. Find peace, please." Becca echoed me, her own voice quavering. The thunderous chaos loomed, as if the ghostly driver might run us down. At the last second, the entire image wavered, the horses rearing, the coach lurching. Another scream pierced the darkness. Then it all dissolved, the wagon shape collapsing into swirling shadow. The hoofbeats slammed to silence, leaving an echoing hush that rang in my ears. Becca sobbed softly, arms around me. My own heart hammered, tears streaking my cheeks. We stared at the clearing, the memorial sign still standing. A gentle breeze fluttered the lantern flames. Then, faintly, a whisper of wind sighed among the trees, as though an unseen presence exhaled relief. We waited, breathless, but no new sounds came. Eventually, we doused the fire, adrenaline still roiling, and stumbled back into the house, collapsed on the floor, minds reeling from what we'd witnessed. When dawn broke, the clearing lay peaceful. No fresh wagon ruts, no sign of the coach's passage. The sign stood upright, the ground around it undisturbed. For the first time since I'd arrived, I felt no tension in the air. The forest's hush was simply nature's hush, not brimming with restless energy. Becca and I exchanged stunned glances, both believing we'd ended the nightly terror. Over the following nights, indeed, no hoofbeats echoed. No screams split the darkness. I slept soundly, lulled by the normal symphony of crickets and owls. My days returned to an academic joy, scouring the trail for relics, taking notes, drafting a small book about the route's history, and the ghostly loop we'd freed from its endless doom. Becca updated her blog with a cryptic mention of the stagecoach that found peace, though she left out specific coordinates to respect my privacy. These days, I live on the trail in relative calm. The log house stands firm. Sometimes I stand at dusk near the sign we erected, watching the sun turn the trees golden, and I feel a wave of gratitude. The travelers we'd glimpsed, that doomed coach, finally rests. The hush around me is gentle, not menacing. I think about how tragedy can echo across centuries if unacknowledged. By naming it, by giving it closure, we bridged that gap, freed them from reliving their final horror. And in turn, I found a sense of belonging here, an off-grid caretaker of a once-haunted road. I remain Elias Carter, caretaker of an old log house on the old Shawnee Stagecoach Trail, forging a quiet life. The forest's hush is no longer haunted, but brimming with subtle wonders. Deer roaming the ruts at dawn, a chorus of frogs in the damp hollows, and an ancient route that once bustled with life, now content to rest in memory. Sometimes I imagine I catch a faint echo of wheels or a distant neigh, but it's probably just my imagination. Or maybe it's the past's gentle reminder that it's still here, watching, grateful we set things right. Either way, I'm at peace, the ghost's at peace, the hush now a friend. And that's all I ever wanted, to live in the pages of history, not as its victim, but as a witness who offered compassion to the shadows that linger between the living and the dead. I remember the thrum of my car's engine fading into the primal hush of the redwood forest the day I finally arrived. The GPS on my phone had quit miles ago, leaving me to navigate by an old paper map, each turn deeper into Northern California's wild green heart. I was Dana Fryer, 32, freshly escaped from city life, determined to find quiet and creative rebirth among the ancient giants near the Klamath River. I'd read about this patch of land for sale, barely a clearing carved out of thick redwoods, perched on a slope overlooking a bend of the Klamath. My entire savings had gone into buying it, rigging a small yurt, and praying I could paint again, find my muse in the silent cathedral of trees. When I saw the rutted track that supposedly led to my property, my stomach lurched with nerves and excitement. It was little more than 2 wheel ruts through towering trunks, the canopy so dense that sunlight barely touched the ferns. The smell of earth and wood smoke from distant cabins teased the air. I maneuvered my battered pickup slowly, hoping not to bottom out on exposed roots. Each turn brought me deeper into dim shadows. At last, the path opened onto a slight clearing no bigger than a backyard, with a single yurt rising from the mossy ground. Its canvas walls looked bleached by sun and battered by wind, perched on a modest wooden platform. Next to it, I spotted a small wind turbine squeaking in the faint breeze, and a row of solar panels angled for what little sunlight the redwoods allowed. The Klamath River's roar echoed in the background, less a roar, more a patient hush of water moving through canyons. I parked, cut the engine, and stepped out. Immediately, the forest hush swallowed me. No city hum, no traffic, just the whisper of wind in redwood needles and the distant rush of the river. It felt like a temple, the towering trunks rising overhead like columns in a grand hall. My chest tightened with gratitude. This was where I would live, off the grid, capturing the soul of these ancient giants in my watercolors. I hopped up the yurt's few steps, gear in hand, and shoved open the flap. Inside, it was spare but workable, an open round space with a cot, a tiny wood stove, and shelves for supplies. My small generator sat in a corner, and a pair of LED lamps waited to be powered by the solar array. Dust motes danced in a shaft of golden light that pierced a gap in the canopy. I breathed in the faint smell of canvas and pine. This was it, my new start. I spent days settling in, rigging my small water catchment barrel for showers, setting up a composting toilet in a makeshift outhouse, and hauling wood from fallen branches. The forest kept me on my toes. Giant ferns that tangled my ankles, thick moss that made each step slippery, and the gloom that turned midday into twilight. But the hush inspired me. Each morning, I'd set my easel outside, attempt to paint the interplay of fog and trunks, the bright green of ferns. My brush kept stumbling, though, as if I couldn't quite capture the forest's living spirit. I told myself it was just warming up, that soon I'd find my muse. Then the first odd thing happened. One evening, as dusk deepened, I went to gather some fallen wood for my stove. Trudging through the undergrowth, flashlight in hand, I noticed a small bundle of twigs hanging from a low branch, woven into a spiral shape. I leaned closer. It looked deliberately crafted, not random. The twigs were bound with a strip of bark, forming a pattern that made me shiver. Could it be a local's idea of art? Or some trail marker? My heart thumped uncomfortably. I brought it back to the yurt out of curiosity, setting it on a shelf. But the moment I did, I felt uneasy, like I'd violated a boundary. Over the next days, more such talismans appeared, dangling from branches near my clearing, tucked into the crooks of giant roots. They varied in shape, some spiral, some star-like, all formed from twigs and bark strips. I hadn't heard or seen anyone visiting. At first, I wondered if a local was pranking me or if there was some old redwood tradition. But as the nights wore on, the sense of being watched grew. The forest hush took on a tense quality, especially at dusk when fog drifted in from the river. I'd lie in my cot, hearing the river's distant murmur, but also a low chanting whisper that might have been wind, or might have been something else. My anxiety peaked when I discovered footprints near my water barrel, small, human-shaped footprints pressed into the moist soil, leading away into the ferns. They ended abruptly, as though the person vanished. My gut twisted with fear. That same night, I heard something outside, a soft pattering around the yurt's perimeter. I grabbed my flashlight, flung open the flap, but saw only swirling fog. My light revealed nothing except giant trunks and the glimmer of dew on leaves. Yet the sense of a presence lingered. I realized with a chill that I might not be alone here in these woods. Feeling cornered, I ventured into a small ranger station near Redwood National Park, hoping for guidance. That's where I met Miles Beck, a local ranger in his 40s with a steady, thoughtful demeanor. He listened as I described the talismans, footprints, and chanting, his brow furrowed. "We do get missing hiker reports sometimes," he said, "and a few mention weird sightings. Redwood forests can disorient people, but you might have stumbled on something else." I pressed him for more, and he hesitated, eventually admitting that there were rumors of an old woodland cult, or an ancient redwood spirit that demanded tribute. Some say there's a hidden group in these groves, or a presence that lures wanderers. "I'm not big on superstition," he said, "but be careful." After that talk, I felt both relieved that I wasn't imagining things and more terrified. If a hidden cult roamed these woods, leaving totems, they might not appreciate my presence. Or, if it was a redwood spirit, it might see me as an intruder. Either way, I stepped warily around my clearing, scanning for watchers in the trees. I considered leaving, but my stubborn pride insisted I remain. I'd come here to find solace and create art, not be chased off by illusions or half-baked legends. A week later, I awoke to frantic knocking on my yurt's canvas. My heart leapt into my throat. Daylight was just creeping in. On the porch stood Miles, out of breath, eyes darting. He told me a hiker had gone missing near my area, last seen searching for old redwood trees. The search party found tracks leading toward my slope, but then lost them in dense fog. "Have you seen or heard anything unusual last night?" he asked. My mind flashed to the chanting whispers I'd half caught before sleeping, a soft, rhythmic hum that lulled me. I'd dismissed it as wind in the canopy, but now I wasn't sure. I told him about the faint chanting, and he paled. "We'll keep searching," he said. "If you see anything, let me know." That morning, I accompanied him for a while, calling the hiker's name, trudging through ferns. But the forest swallowed our voices, giving no sign of a lost soul. My fear mounted that this presence, or cult, had taken the hiker. Over the next few nights, the chanting grew more pronounced at dusk, echoing among the trunks. At times, it felt like multiple voices weaving a hypnotic melody, drawing me to the grove behind my yurt. I resisted, bolting the yurt flap. I discovered new talismans, twigs shaped into small figures with elongated limbs, perched on my porch rail. My sleep turned fitful. My paintings stagnated, overshadowed by dread. Occasionally, the wind parted the fog, and I'd glimpse a shape among the redwoods, tall, impossibly thin, gliding behind thick trunks. My gut twisted in raw panic. Something out there was watching me, leaving these ominous signs, chanting in that low murmur that made my skin crawl. At wit's end, I confided in Aiko Perez, my best friend from the city who'd come for a weekend visit to see how I was settling. She was appalled at my jumpiness and the bizarre artifacts. "Dana, this is too weird," she said, cradling one of the twig figurines. "We have to do something. Maybe call the sheriff or get a big dog." But Redwood County lacked robust enforcement, and the nearest town was more than an hour away. Plus, I had no phone signal to call for help. We decided to gather more evidence, try to catch glimpses of the chanting group on camera. So, one night, we set up a small stakeout. We killed our lights, crouching behind a log near the yurt with Aiko's phone camera ready, though we had little hope of capturing anything in such low light. The chanting began around midnight. the same eerie hum drifting closer. My heart thundered. Fog curled around the redwoods, turning them into silent giants. Then we saw shapes, a circle of figures in the faint gloom, no more than silhouettes, weaving among the trunks behind the yurt. At least 4 or 5. The chanting rose in volume, a rhythmic drone that sent goosebumps down my arms. A pungent smell, like wet earth and decaying leaves, wafted in. My breath caught as I realized these figures wore strange headpieces or headdresses of branches. One parted from the circle, placing a talisman on the ground. Then, as if sensing us, they all froze. The chanting halted. In the hush, I heard my own ragged breathing. A second later, the group melted away among the trunks, vanishing with uncanny swiftness. Aiko and I were left trembling, adrenaline roaring in our veins. Her phone captured only darkness and muffled chanting. The next day, we discovered footprints near the site. Barefoot, elongated toes, each print sunk deep as though they were heavy or unnaturally tall. The talisman they left was the size of a child's doll, shaped from twisted twigs, draped with soggy moss. My stomach lurched. This was no casual joke. The feeling of an ancient cult or redwood spirit leaving warnings to intruders overwhelmed me. Aiko insisted we pack up and flee, but I, stubborn as ever, refused. Something about this place called me still, some primal beauty I couldn't abandon. Instead, we reached out to Miles, the ranger, describing what we'd witnessed. He frowned gravely. "I can't confirm a cult," he said, "but the missing hiker's case remains open. We suspect he strayed too far. These woods are unkind to the careless." Yet care felt inadequate against a group that moved like ghosts in the fog. My paintings languished. I couldn't find calm. Nights turned into an ordeal of anxious listening, waiting for chanting that teased my sanity. I felt a growing certainty that the Redwood Watchers wanted me gone or subjugated. They seemed to feed on the fear swirling in my chest, as though each pulse of terror drew them closer. Eventually, Aiko left, promising she'd alert authorities if I failed to check in. Days bled into nights. I grew hollow-eyed from poor sleep. The chanting got bolder, a beckoning that sometimes circled my yurt, voices drifting on the wind. On one particularly foggy evening, I snapped. I couldn't remain a trembling bystander. If these watchers or spirit worshippers demanded tribute, maybe an offering or an apology might quell them, as in old legends. Or, if it was a redwood spirit, perhaps a show of respect would earn safe passage. I decided on a final confrontation or a potential truce. I gathered all the twig talismans they'd left, plus the bizarre figure, placed them in a circle near the largest redwood behind my yurt. Then, heart pounding, I lit a small candle, setting it in the center. I spoke in a trembling voice. "Whoever you are, I acknowledge your domain. I don't wish to harm these trees. I'm here to paint, to live lightly. Please, let me stay in peace." My words echoed lamely in the silent grove. I felt foolish, but also desperate. Then the chanting arose, so close it felt like the forest floor vibrated. My candle flame flickered. The shapes emerged from the fog again, that circle of tall, gaunt figures wearing headpieces of branches. My chest constricted in panic. Their chanting turned urgent. I forced myself not to run. "I offer these items back," I said, gesturing to the twig talismans. "I promise not to desecrate your land." The chanting swelled, reaching a feverish pitch. One figure stepped forward, raising an arm. My flashlight beam caught the glint of wet bark or hide. Its face was hidden behind a mask of branches. I stifled a scream. My mind flashed to the missing hiker. Was he gone forever? Summoning every shred of courage, I bowed my head, arms spread wide in a gesture of surrender. "I yield to the forest's guardians," I murmured, tears welling. The figure let out a rasping sound, maybe a grunt or breath. Then, all at once, the chanting stopped. The circle broke, and the watchers receded into the trees, leaving me alone with my pounding heartbeat. My candle guttered out, plunging me into near darkness, save for the faint glow of my flashlight. For a moment I stood trembling, mind whirling with 1,000 questions. Then I realized I could breathe again. No chanting, no oppressive sense of dread. The watchers had melted away. Had they accepted my offering? Was I free from their nightly visits? In the weeks that followed, the chanting never returned. I discovered no new talismans. On the contrary, the forest seemed gentler, the redwood hush more welcoming. My nightmares eased. I found myself able to paint again, capturing the silent majesty of the groves in watercolors that poured from me in a burst of creativity. The missing hiker was never found, which still troubled me, but it seemed I'd negotiated a fragile truce with whatever force or group haunted these woods. Perhaps they recognized my sincerity in respecting the ancient trees, in living lightly on the land. Miles occasionally checked in, noticing I looked less harried. I admitted I'd made peace with the watchers, though I didn't elaborate. Something told me an official approach might provoke them. Instead, I quietly thrived. My small solar kit, wind turbine, and generator gave me enough power for lights and a mini fridge. I'd gather mushrooms from the forest floor, fish from the Klamath if I felt adventurous. The redwood watchers lurked, maybe, but they no longer circled my yurt with chanting or placed ominous totems. I'd find occasional footprints near the biggest trees, but that was it. Each night, the hush felt expansive rather than threatening, as if the forest breathed a gentler rhythm. I'd watch fog swirl around ancient trunks, a tableau of living history that dwarfed my petty human concerns. Now, as I stand on a mild spring dawn, the rising sun filters through the redwood canopy, painting my clearing with golden beams. I clutch a fresh canvas, gazing at the giant trunk that dwarfs my yurt. I think of the watchers, the chanting, the bizarre totems. My chest tightens with memories of raw fear, but I also feel gratitude. Something out here tested me, maybe a spirit older than the redwood seeds themselves, or a cult who'd taken redwood worship to extremes. They might remain, hidden in the thick groves. Yet I'm not cowering, not fleeing. I'm painting, living, coexisting. My watercolor brush dips into a swirl of green paint. I begin to capture the morning light on bark, letting the hush of the forest fill me with calm. When the painting's done, I step back, smiling. The redwood watchers, if they exist, can see I honor this place. My presence is a guest in a domain far older than any city. I can't explain the watchers in a rational sense, nor do I want to break this fragile peace by prying further. Some mysteries are best left dancing among the ferns and fog. If they demanded anything more, I'd sense it. For now, they let me remain, a respectful visitor in their ancient realm. I remain Dana Fryer, traveling watercolor artist turned redwood homesteader, forging a life in the hush of giant trees. My nights are quiet now, free of chanting, my days filled with the music of the Klamath's flow. I greet the watchers in the back of my mind each morning, a silent acknowledgement. And though I never learned exactly who or what they are, I learned that humility, an offering, and a promise to tread lightly can go far in bridging the chasm between humankind and nature's deepest shadows. So, the redwood shadows near the Klamath River stand tall, unbroken, older than memory, and I dwell among them, painting their silent grandeur, unafraid. The watchers, if ever they choose to step from the fog again, will find me still at my easel, brush in hand, ready to bow my head and whisper, "Thank you for letting me stay."